Hey everybody, this is Jonathan.
And Sean.
We're here to talk about stuff, as always. This is the second podcast for this week, episode 189. If you didn't hear last episode, we had to record kind of mid of the week. We had a lot of stuff to talk about, so we split this big recording we did into two episodes. The earlier episode this week, 188, is where we talked about Doctor Who and some other pieces of news and fun stuff like that. Today's episode that you're listening to, 189, we are talking about Twin Peaks.
Yeah. All Twin Peaks, all the time.
We've promised it for a long time. You're about to get a good 3-hour plus discussion on Twin Peaks. I haven't edited it yet. I don't know how long it is. It's long. It's a really good episode. We prepared for it a lot. We had fun recording it.
Yeah.
It's a good one.
Yeah. So, enjoy.
Enjoy. All right. So, Sean, you ready to talk some Twin Peaks?
Have we ever been ready to... Is anybody ever ready to talk about Twin Peaks, Jonathan?
I think we are. So, Twin Peaks, show that aired 1990, 1991, just before either of us were born.
Yeah.
So we obviously did not watch it during its original run.
No.
There are many, many avenues we could tackle this from.
Yes.
Yes, there are. We got the new show coming back. We're excited for it. We're fans of the show. I guess I would just come down to... I'll ask you this first. Sort of what's your relationship with the show, with David Lynch's kind of work and that kind of stuff, and how'd you come to this, and just a general, what makes it special?
Yeah, so I guess, with Twin Peaks specifically, this is it's the history of me with Twin Peaks is the history of us saying we're going to do a Twin Peaks episode on this podcast, because I think I actually watched the first season of Twin Peaks before you did.
Yeah, definitely did.
Yeah, which was because that was I think that was when we were sophomores in college, because it was definitely I watched it when we were in the condo, and I watched the first season and then the first couple of episodes of season 2, and then just kind of dropped off of it because there's I think it was around the time finals were happening or something, is when I had the brilliant idea to start fucking watching Twin Peaks. But I loved the first season and I loved the beginning of season 2 and just kept on wanting to go back to it. But also Twin Peaks is such a serialized show that if you're away from it from a month or two, it's I'm gonna have to rewatch the whole first season again before because I've forgotten half of the supporting characters or something. And if I wanted to jump into season 2. So it's I loved season 1. I thought it was so amazing, but then just fell off of it. And then you ended up watching Twin Peaks and watching all of the David Lynch stuff and getting really into it. And then you're oh, we need to do a Twin Peaks episode on the podcast because you knew I liked the season 1. And I was I'll finish watching Twin Peaks at some point. And then cut 3 years later or something, finally I got around to watching it and watching the whole thing. And then you let me borrow the Fire Walk With Me Blu-ray, and so I watched that. And yeah, I think Twin Peaks it's an amazing TV show. It's an insane TV show. I think it is, as everyone knows, it is a TV show that very much loses itself in season 2 in a lot of ways, but also kind of the ways it loses itself are almost as fascinating as when it was good. It's just fascinating in a very different way. But it's just a show that's so utterly unique and so rare for television, especially at the time and even now, to have that kind of real sense of core vision and core direction, but also have it be this crazy sprawling show with all these different characters and weird subplots. But when Twin Peaks was on, none of those subplots consumed anything. None of the different parts of the show overwhelmed any other parts of the show, and it was this perfect, insane mixture. And I just loved every single part of it. And then season 2 just goes crazy and it's kind of fun, but also I feel that show gets away from itself in such a way that it loses so much of the magic that was the heart of Twin Peaks to me. And then I watched Fire Walk With Me, the movie, and as I think I put out that tweet the night I watched it, that is to me easily one of the top 10 American horror movies I've ever seen. I think Fire Walk With Me to me is it's not just the ultimate version of Twin Peaks, because there's a lot of things that this more soap opera stuff in Twin Peaks that is not really represented much in Fire Walk With Me for good reason. So it's like, it's not like this is the best Twin Peaks thing, or this is like symbolic of everything that Twin Peaks is Fire Walk with Me, but is like for the Laura Palmer and sort of like weird horror, magical realism, whatever sort of side of that show. It is like the most pure distillation of that kind of horror. It is like one of, if not maybe the best examples of like suburban horror I've ever seen, in capturing that sense of, was a very Lynchian theme, because I've watched, I haven't seen every Lynch movie, but I've watched like Elephant Man, I've watched Blue Velvet, I've watched Dune. Was probably actually the first David Lynch thing I saw, not because it was David Lynch, because I liked the book, and that movie is fucking insane, and people should watch that movie if you've read the book. It's not a good movie. It is an amazing movie. But
Dune, weirdly enough, is one of the only David Lynch films I haven't seen.
Yes.
I actually tried to make time to watch it before this podcast, and I just couldn't fit it in because I was doing a lot of other research for this.
Yeah.
So let me tell my story.
Yeah.
Which is that in film school, I saw, like, in film school, almost every David Lynch film. Like, they were just shown to me in different classes.
All of them except for the best one, Dune.
Yeah. Mostly from one particular teacher who is my, basically, mentor and did both of my thesis projects and all this stuff. Love her to death. And she just loved showing certain Lynch films in her classes, because if you teach the kind of film studies that I am more in tune with, which is, I am not, you can kind of split a lot of film studies roughly into like film theory and film criticism.
Right.
And film theory is where you get a lot more structuralist stuff and all of that. And I am not so much a theory person. And Lynch does fit very neatly into certain camps of theory, such as psychoanalysis.
Right.
But more in terms of the non-structural, the atmospheric, and the effervescent kind of film studies that I'm a little more interested in, David Lynch is so good for so many styles of those. Whether it is the sort of historical mishmash of The Elephant Man, or the, Blue Velvet, also suburban horror, also very Freudian, also, very much about culture and about a reflexive and a reflective version of nostalgia. You can, Mulholland Drive, which is a lot of those same qualities. There's kind of a David Lynch film for every film studies occasion, other than probably 3-act structure.
Sure. Yeah.
Other than that, you can kind of find a David Lynch film for kind of anything you want, even though he hasn't made that many movies. Yeah. Even his film, The Straight Story, which a lot of you probably have never heard of. It's one of his best films, and that is it's the best film made about the American Midwest I think I've ever seen. And I mean, like, it's set in Iowa, which is where I was born, where I go, a couple times a year.
Right.
And it's about this, it's a true story about this guy who rode his tractor all the way across Iowa to go visit his brother who just had a stroke. And it's an amazing, amazing movie. It stars Richard Farnsworth, who a year later committed suicide because he was dying at the time of the film, and so it's part of his performance. And, that's a movie you can show just about love and sibling, connections and regret and these things. So there's something for every kind of. Lynch checks all these boxes. And it took me a couple of years in film school seeing all these Lynch films, noticing like, yeah, this guy has become one of my favorite directors ever. And around this same time, I think there was a growing, not critical reevaluation, but a growing critical consciousness around Lynch, because Criterion started getting their hands on some of Lynch's films. They put out both Eraserhead and Mulholland Drive, both of which were badly in need of a nice, reissue on Blu-ray and stuff like that. And those also got out all of his short films. And, the Twin Peaks stuff was kind of in the ether of something might be happening with it, because this revival took many years of discussion and David Lynch dropping out and then coming back on and blah, blah, blah.
And plus, like, as with a lot of older TV shows, Twin Peaks had like a sort of cultural revival when it came onto Netflix as well.
Came onto Netflix, they did that big Blu-ray set of Twin Peaks, which was also badly needed because, there had actually never been a good version of Fire Walk with Me on DVD. The version that was out there for years had errors, actually, in the authoring of the movie.
Yeah, I mean, that's why I needed to borrow your Blu-ray set, because there was, like, no easy way to get that movie other than to, like, buy everything on Blu-ray.
Right. So, I think Lynch has kind of been in the critical ether, but I kind of realized once I had seen most of his films in film school, and then I went back and watched, we had seen clips of Eraserhead. We'd never watched the whole thing. And Eraserhead is one of those rare movies that kind of works just as well in clip form as it does in its totality, in a weird way. I saw in multiple classes the sequence in Eraserhead, the Eraserhead sequence, which is the most surrealistic piece of that movie, probably, which is the long, like, dream-esque, what isn't a dream in that movie? I don't know. But where he, like, there's the pencil factory and his head gets turned into an eraser and all that. I think I saw that in multiple classes before I actually sat down when Criterion put the Blu-ray out and watched the movie. And I was like, Yeah, that scene makes no more sense in context than it does out of it. And I love that. I love that about David Lynch. And then I saw, so after all of that, the Twin Peaks Blu-ray set had come out, and so I've been hearing about Twin Peaks all my life because it is such a touchstone of American television. Yeah. And I was like, well, I am so in the weeds on this guy. I've obviously got to see what I think for many is his magnum opus, which is Twin Peaks. I don't want to forget that, Mark Frost is the co-creator, huge creative force on it, but obviously it is a huge part of the David Lynch filmography. And so then I watched the show and fell in love with it and find it fascinating. And I don't know if it's my favorite David Lynch thing. I do think it's probably worth calling his magnum opus in some ways because it is so all-encompassing of the different things that fascinate him as a filmmaker and as an artist. Yeah. And especially now that we're going to have 18 solid more hours of it, I mean, that's going to completely rewrite the narrative around the show, I think. But what struck me, I think, in weird ways about Twin Peaks when I saw it for the first time is how neatly, in a lot of ways, it fits into our current moment of television.
Right.
I think Twin Peaks was prestige TV as we define it now 10 years before The Sopranos came on the air.
Yeah.
It just happened to be made on ABC in 1990, and of course it is a much less consistent show than all of the great, American TV shows of the 2000s because it has this very weird second season and goes up and down in quality. But, at its best, Twin Peaks I think is totally on that level where it is fiercely cinematic in its approach to how it makes its episodes. And it brings a level of, I think, production consciousness to bear that TV had never really had before on that level. Like in certain things, like, certain episodes of The Twilight Zone and stuff. But in terms of an ongoing narrativized TV show, Twin Peaks totally broke the mold on that in terms of how it birthed a whole generation of great cable TV directors. Didn't birth them, but brought them to TV, like people like Tim Hunter, who, directed a bunch of Mad Men and stuff like that, 20 years later. And I think its approach to, breaking out of the box in terms of not just its weirdness, but I think its approach to not letting things easily add up and artistically challenging the viewer, that took longer than getting to The Sopranos. Yeah. That took, to me, until now with, like, Hannibal and The Leftovers, which I think are the two most clearest descendants of Twin Peaks in terms of American TV, and those are shows made in the 2010s, 3 decades later. And so it is interesting that Twin Peaks had these immense, huge ripple effects, some of which were felt kind of immediately, like The X-Files owes a big debt to Twin Peaks. Yeah. Partially because David Duchovny is on Twin Peaks for 3 episodes, and he's the best part of those 3 episodes. Yeah. But just that, that's one thing that was kind of felt from it, and The X-Files has its whole lineage. But I do think a lot of the prestige idea of it, it's weird that Twin Peaks is entering back into TV in a world where it fits a lot more. In some ways, and in some ways it doesn't, because Twin Peaks also is a sort of a mystery box of a show, which is something people love to obsess over now. But it is so against the trends of, I think, TV criticism these days of 10 things we need answered from Twin Peaks,
right?
Which I'm already seeing written online, and it's David Lynch is not built for the current clickbait culture, which I love about him. And so that's what's going to be so fascinating to me about seeing these new 18 episodes is that I think Twin Peaks is absolutely of this moment that we are in TV's kind of new golden age. And it just arrived many years too early, kind of. But it is also still an outsider to a lot of that. And, you see that with, the response to, like I said, The Leftovers and Hannibal, where some corners of the internet couldn't get their heads around them because those are not episodes made for clickbait,
right?
So anyway, that's kind of my long, rambling introduction reaction. I love David Lynch. I think he's an amazing filmmaker. I also think his influence on American TV cannot be overstated because of Twin Peaks.
Absolutely.
So, yeah.
And then through all of that, somehow you still haven't seen Dune. God damn it.
Through all that, I still haven't seen Dune. I have the Blu-ray. I've got the Blu-ray. I have not watched it yet.
Should only watch it in the most pristine format possible.
Indeed. Well, that's an easier way to get it these days. Yeah, it's. I think it's kind of amazing that whatever studio made Dune made it a priority to get a Blu-ray of that movie out.
That movie is, again, it's not I would never really call it a good movie, but if you've read the book and therefore know already what the plot of the movie is and who the characters are, you can enjoy the insanity that movie is in a way that, like, I legitimately love that movie.
No, I totally get it. I'm just saying, like, most of David Lynch's films are not on Blu-ray in the U.S. I love that that's, like, one of the 4. It's just funny to me.
And it's like, it's one of his earlier movies, too. Because that's before Blue Velvet, isn't it?
Yep, that's his third movie. I mean, let's talk about that a little bit, the history of where Twin Peaks came in chronologically. And I should say, for part of my research, I recommend 2 books on this. My favorite book on Lynch you can get is called Lynch on Lynch. It's by Chris Rodley, and it's a collection of interviews he did with David Lynch. And so it's like a solid, 300 pages of just conversations with him. And I love David Lynch's voice so much. He talks, like, if you love Agent Dale Cooper on Twin Peaks, that is just David Lynch. Mm-hmm. Like, it is such a clear conduit to him. In fact, I want to read something from this right now, just to describe the beauty of Twin Peaks in, like, one paragraph. Here's why I love this book so much, and I'll get back to the point I was making. Yeah. But, so this is from the chapter on Twin Peaks. And Chris Rodley says, how difficult was it to find a location that matched your ideas of this town? It's a simple question. They're talking about location scouting. Here's what David Lynch says. Well, once it became the Northwest, we just went up there and did a lot of location scouting and found a lot of great, great places. Like the sawmill. That was pretty incredible because it was a beautiful old sawmill. Now, when they grow a tree, it gets to 24 inches in diameter and they hack it down. But then they have this old stand, with trees that were, like, ancient and huge. And one of my favorite woods is vertical grain Douglas fir. It's just beautiful stuff. Now, it's different. The rings are further apart because the trees are more like weeds, They let them grow to a certain size and, phew, off they go. They even have a thing now that pinches the thing off. They don't cut them, they pinch them. Anyway, this place had some 5 or 6 foot in diameter logs floating in the pond out there that they saved for us. And they'd bring them up in this big chain conveyor belt and whack them off with this giant circular saw. And then this woman in a hard hat would come out with a stick and touch the log, and she's the highest paid person on the floor of the sawmill. And then there's another page where Chris Rodley asks him about that, and he explains how that's the origin of the log lady. Yeah. That is one of my favorite paragraphs in the English language. Yeah. Is David Lynch obsessing over a Douglas fir at a sawmill.
Yeah, and it highlights, like, for people listening to this, if you have never, like, seen interviews with David Lynch, he's, like, the best person. Oh, like, yeah. And it's something that I always love when you have a director or writer or whoever, that, like, the sort of, like, a creative visionary that in their medium that is also just, like, they're eccentric, but they also seem like the nicest person on the planet, and that's, like, it's so nice, because so often you, like, research someone who's, like, you like all their books or something, you find out, oh, this guy's a real asshole, but then you're, like, you would think maybe that would happen with David Lynch because of how, like, out there some of his movies are, and then you see interviews with this, like, no, yeah, he's just, like, he's a little bit of a goofball, but he's the sweetest dude on the planet, and I love that so much, and I think it comes through in a lot of his movies, but in particular, like in Twin Peaks, you get that side of him so much.
Because Twin Peaks has such a good heart to it. Yeah. As dark as some of it gets. But no, I wanted to introduce that to this discussion because if we're talking about kind of his history, he is actually a director where I think it is very useful to know the guy a little bit when talking about his movies, because he actually has done a lot of interviews, and there's this whole book and other things where he's okay talking about his work, but he doesn't give away things about his work. He doesn't give you a strict interpretation. He doesn't talk about he still has never divulged the details of how they made the baby in Eraserhead, things like that. So he's good at keeping the mystery alive around these things, but he also is willing to kind of talk, and it often just becomes about his philosophies on life and stuff, and he is a just thoroughly fascinating dude. Yeah. And, his whole history, you talk about Dune, that's his third film. And he had such a fascinating rise and kind of immediate fall and then Blue Velvet through the industry. Yeah. Where he was a painter initially. And you should look at some of his paintings because they're kind of fascinating. A very avant-garde painter. Right. And then he went to the American Film Institute. So he is from basically that first generation of American film students. Probably like a little later than George Lucas and Francis Ford Coppola and Martin Scorsese and all those guys. But basically that era where, the AFI was new, film schools were new in the United States, and he was one of the first people to kind of take advantage of that. And he was at the AFI, which is where he made several shorts, which are, the Eraserhead Blu-ray by Criterion has like a complete collection of his AFI shorts. Nice. Which is cool because they're very interesting. His first movie he ever made is called Six Men Getting Sick Six Times, I think. And it's great. It's an art installation project where he painted these like faces onto a wall and then projected basically them vomiting and it's a loop. It's like a 1 minute loop, and I think the Blu-ray presents it as a 5 minute thing, so you get the sense of the loop, but it doesn't go on forever. And it's interesting to look at. And that's the first thing he did, and then he kind of moved on from there. And the first movie he made was Eraserhead, and Eraserhead took 5 years to film. And so they shot it on and off over 5 years. Jack Nance, who was the star of that and went on to be in all of Lynch's films until his death, had to have that crazy hair for like 5 years.
Great.
Which is wonderful.
I always love that with actors when like they have like that kind of long running project or something like goes on hiatus temporarily, and it's like all of a sudden it's like, you mean I have to keep this ridiculous beard for like 5 months?
Yeah. Eraserhead, because of the time it took to film, it was not completely made by the American Film Institute in terms of its funding, but they're like credited on the movie and everything. So he finally gets this movie made, and it is about, and you know, there are so many ways to psychoanalyze Eraserhead, and Lynch will give you little clues and stuff, because he'll talk about, like, he had his first daughter at the time, and she was born with clubbed feet, and people love to make the connection, oh, that's why you have the baby in Eraserhead and all this, and he will never say yes to that question, but he'll never deny it either. It's kind of fascinating. But it is Eraserhead, I think, is one of the scariest movies I've ever seen, while also being funny and weird and all these wonderful things, because it is this movie about these deep-seated insecurities done in this very crazily expressionistic way. Like, that movie, of all of Lynch's films, is truly surrealist, I would say, in that it's like Louis Spoonwell surrealism in the film sense. But even then, it's like, Lynch does not fit easily into any genre.
No,
and even starting there. But basically, Eraserhead went out on the midnight movie circuit, started getting a cult following, and then studios, because weird people work at studios too, even though we think of them as like people in suits, sometimes weirdos work there too, including people who love Eraserhead, and it's time to make a movie called The Elephant Man, which was produced by a gentleman named Mel Brooks.
Yeah,
which you might not know.
Yes, there's a pretty good interview on YouTube I saw sometime where he talks about that process of getting hired for Elephant Man and meeting Mel Brooks and all that stuff.
Yep, and Mel Brooks liked Eraserhead and hired David Lynch, and that, to this day, is the most, I think, like, mainstream critical world has embraced David Lynch, other than maybe Mulholland Drive. But The Elephant Man had 7 Academy Award nominations.
Right.
Like, I think people forget that. That was a successful movie. That was an acclaimed movie. It was up for everything. That David Lynch got a Best Director nomination. His second movie ever. But he's already kind of in the system at this point. Yeah. And then comes Dune, which was produced by Dino De Laurentiis, who would later produce Blue Velvet, and Dune was not that great experience. And Lynch, the chapter on that in this Lynch on Lynch book is fascinating, because he is pretty open about how much he hated that experience on Dune, because it just kind of got out of hand. It's kind of like what happens now sometimes with superhero movies, where you'll get someone who's made like 2 independent films.
Like Mark Webb on Amazing Spider-Man.
Right, and they, or maybe an even better one, is like the Fantastic Four movie where they got Josh Trank and he just completely melted down on set. That's not what happened with David Lynch and Dune, but it's, it was not the best experience in the world. Although it is where he met Kyle MacLachlan.
Yeah.
Who, if you haven't ever seen a picture of David Lynch, just imagine an older Dale Cooper. They look the same. Like, Kyle MacLachlan is his muse because it's like a younger him.
Yeah.
But anyway, they make Dune. It's a big flop at the time. Dune, of course, was also this project that Hollywood had been trying to make for at least a decade. There's that documentary now called Jodorowsky's Dune.
Yeah.
About Alejandro Jodorowsky and his attempts to make that film, which eventually, like, most of the art of that just went on to the film Alien, which we mentioned earlier, because H.R. Geiger was the guy doing the art direction for the Jodorowsky version of Dune. But anyway, so I think for a lot of people that would have just kind of been the end of their career, sadly, would be Dune. And then he had been circulating this script for Blue Velvet since like the 70s. He wrote it around the time of Eraserhead, I think, an early version of it. And there were still enough people who believed in this guy because, as we said, David Lynch is fundamentally a nice person who's good to work with. He's not an eccentric in the way that he like pisses people off on set.
Yeah.
And so Dino De Laurentiis, as I understand, still wanted to do something with David Lynch, even though Dune didn't work. And he said, what do you want to do most in the world? It's like, I want to make Blue Velvet. And of course, no one quite understood why, I think, at first.
Right.
And Lynch even says his first drafts for that movie were, he thinks, no good. It took a while for him to really figure out what that movie was. But yeah, what's so interesting to me about David Lynch is he had that first film, Eraserhead. Then he goes off into Hollywood studio land and makes these 2 movies. And then the way he rescues his own career is he makes fucking Blue Velvet.
Yeah.
And he's literally never looked back. He has never done a typical movie since then. Even The Straight Story, which I think was made by a subsidiary of Disney or something, that is still very much a Lynch personal passion project thing. he just carved his own like direction with this and kept going, even though he made a lot of controversial stuff along the way.
Yeah.
Blue Velvet was really controversial when it came out, even though it had pockets of intense acclaim. So let's talk about Blue Velvet for a moment.
Okay, yeah, because I don't know if I said this on the podcast or if this was before I was recording the podcast, but I rewatched Blue Velvet last night because I wanted to get in the David Lynch mind space, but I was too fresh off of Twin Peaks from a couple months ago, so I was like, I haven't seen Blue Velvet since probably I was like a senior in high school, maybe is when I first watched it, so yeah, it's been a long time. That movie's really good.
I think it's one of the best movies ever made. I think it's
up there.
It's in contention for the title of best film of the 80s. You could definitely say. It's incredible. And I tweeted this the other night because I also watched it the other night. And I said, I really don't think you can fully appreciate Twin Peaks if you don't see Blue Velvet. And you could kind of slot in any other Lynch work and say if you haven't seen Blue Velvet, because it is kind of the skeleton key that unlocks his whole career. It's the Lynch Rosetta Stone.
Sure, yeah.
Because I think it is in some ways like the purest distillation of the Lynchian vision, which is this beautiful suburbia, this beautiful Americana that masks a very, very dark sickness underneath.
Yeah.
And yet those two things are not contradictory. And I think to me that's something that when I watched Blue Velvet this time, that's when I kind of finally got it, is that Lynch is not trying to just say these things exist in opposition, which is how most people, I think, do that kind of theme. He's saying these things exist at the same time. And Blue Velvet is such a wacky and on point and kind of perfect distillation of that idea where you can watch it a dozen times and I think get different views out of it, and none of them are purely pessimistic or purely optimistic.
Yeah. Yeah, because it is something that to me, it's like I said, a lot of times people sort of do it if they do like, the 1950s stereotypical like beautiful America hides like the dark underbelly is a very common theme in American fiction, and a lot of times is either like I said, those two things are in opposition, or it's just that like the idealistic 1950s like white picket fence thing is just a facade and it's all fake, and it's only like the dark underbelly is the real America, and Blue Velvet does not present a very like simple interpretation like that. It doesn't present like the dark underbelly is like the real thing and everything else is just people trying to cover it up, nor is it those two opposite forces fighting against each other. They're like it's something that I think is true about like all of his works, and it's why you can throw around the terms like surrealism or magical realism in different places to describe different things he's done. Is that all those kinds of fiction and those kinds of genres that are still like very hard to sort of like totally pin to most of his works, like one or the other, they all sort of deal with this like sense of everything, like things being two things in one thing at the same time, and like you can't ever really identify the boundaries where one of these things has ended and like where like the dark underbelly has totally stopped and like the like beautiful facade has begun. And that's where like at the end of Blue Velvet you have the shot of the robin coming down eating the bug, and it's like these things like they're the same, they're like one is eating the other, but like also the one is like made from the other, like there's no sort of clear boundary between any of these things. And that's what I love about his stuff, is it's so hard to try to define exactly where these things are and like what they are.
It's also about that boundary between, for lack of a better term, dreams and reality.
Yeah.
And
where it's impossible to tell where like which one is which.
Exactly. And it's one of the things Blue Velvet and Mulholland Drive both do this so beautifully, where a different, I'm not even going to say a lesser filmmaker, just a different filmmaker would take Blue Velvet and make it a lot clearer that like, oh, the Frank stuff is a literal nightmare, and when he's with Laura Dern, that's reality. Because there is a way you can read Blue Velvet as that.
Yes.
And that's a decent way to read that movie. I think it's overly simple, but you can do that. David Lynch doesn't do that.
No.
What he does is Blue Velvet does have this fascinating framing device where early on you go into the ear Jeffrey finds in the woods. Yeah. And then at the end of the movie, there's that great zoom out from Kyle MacLachlan's ear. I wonder how Kyle MacLachlan feels about that there's a close-up that close on his ear out there in the world, because it's kind of weird. There's nothing wrong with his ear. It's just bizarre.
And it might be kind of weird to like think about that every now and then. It's like most people don't know what the inside of the ear looks to that degree,
Yes. And so there is kind of this framing of like, you go inside the canal, you come out. Lynch has a great thing in this book where he says something about the author asks him, well, why do it have to be an ear? And he says, well, it's because an ear is an opening. and I needed like something that has a canal into the body. And it's like, it makes perfect sense to him. And no, so you do have that, and so there's a way to read it of like that's going into the darkness and then coming out of the darkness, but that's not it entirely. That's too neat. And because in the middle of that movie, you can have the one of the best scenes ever put on film is when Jeffrey first breaks into
the jazz singer lady,
lady's apartment, and Isabella Rossellini. I don't remember her. Dorothy Valens. That's it. Valens' apartment. And just that whole long sequence of the voyeurism, and then she catches him, and then she makes him strip, and then he has to go back in, and then that's where you first meet Frank, played by just Dennis Hopper, in one of the best performances ever. All of that, and that is an abject, unfiltered nightmare, right?
Yeah.
In some ways, and it is Freudian, and it is psychoanalytic, and it is so that is a great short film on its own. But then, like, the next day, he's with Laura Dern, and it's like, it's also still a dream. It's this beautiful, idealistic American, girl meets a guy dream.
Yeah. And like, there's that great shot when, like, Laura Dern's first shot in the movie where she steps out of the shadows and she's in this, like, ridiculous, like, she looks like, if, like, a like paint or like a poster from like a 1950s candy shop or something of what a girl looks like.
Yeah.
And then like she's wearing that pink sweater and with like the like really blonde hair, and it's like that person is not real. Like there's so much of like the way he shoots people in those scenes and like the way some people act, where it's like that person, that's not a real person. That's like, but it's also not just a representation of. So like his Frank Booth is not just a representation of Kyle MacLachlan's character's Jeffrey's id or something. It's not as just like clear cut as that. But you can read it that way, but you also can't read it that way.
Yeah, and to me it all comes to a head. I think the scene that is the most key to the entire film is it's part of the extended sequence where you have Kyle MacLachlan has that line early in the movie about how much he loves Heineken, which makes me laugh so hard. And then later it's paid off when there's a long sequence where Frank takes him on a joyride.
Yeah.
And
going on a joyride, fucker!
And Frank asks him, what kind of beer you like? And Jeffrey thinks, I haven't answered this. It's Heineken. And Frank says,
Pabst Blue Ribbon, you motherfucker!
Yep.
Really good.
Yeah. Anyway, they go into the bar, and there's that amazing scene where they sing the Roy Orbison song In Dreams. But then there's a follow-up to that later where they're out, and, Jeffrey, talks back to Frank and all this. And so Frank says, put on Candy-Colored Clown, Candy-Colored Clown. He's put on the lipstick, and he's reading the lyrics, and he's saying, I'm, in dreams, you're mine.
Yeah.
You're mine in dreams. And that, to me, is the whole key of the entire movie, is this blend between dreams and reality, and that Frank is not exactly Jeffrey, but Jeffrey is also not exactly Frank. There's this melding where there are elements of both of those men, in that Jeffrey does fall into this sadistic routine with Valens at some points. He cannot completely deny this guy is a part of him. And Frank also has a weird sensitivity to him that is not dislike Jeffrey. And so it is this, I think, fascinating exploration of, you can call it masculinity. I think it's maybe even more universal than just that, of this darkness within people where all of this exists at the same time, and that Jeffrey cannot deny that this person is part of him too, and that even when he's with Laura Dern, there's that great scene where he thinks Jeffrey is chasing them, but it's really just Laura Dern's boyfriend, Mike. Which, that is the name David Lynch always uses for boyfriends women don't actually like, is Mike. He must have known a Mike at one point he hated.
I mean, we have all known a Mike at one point we've hated. Let's be totally honest.
Yeah. But it's
Mike.
That is this thing about this root of the subconscious or the unconscious, these literal and figurative evil doppelgangers, which I think becomes a theme that is not, I don't think, as well used in Twin Peaks, but it is a huge part of Twin Peaks as well. And so, all of Blue Velvet is that. And going back to that thing about how he views that as America, two quotes here really quick.
Okay.
One is, I just love this line where the writer has this long question, and Lynch's one-sentence answer is, it's like a dream of strange desires wrapped inside a mystery story. That should just be the description on the back of the box for every single Lynch movie.
Yeah.
A dream of strange desires wrapped inside a mystery story. I love that. But then, the author asks, another non-naturalistic part of Blue Velvet is the opening sequence. We got the blue sky, pristine fence, redder than red flowers, all of that. And here's Lynch's answer, and I love this because I think it's important to think about. This is the way America is to me. There's a very innocent, naive quality to life, and there's a horror and a sickness as well. It's everything. Blue Velvet is a very American movie. The look of it was inspired by my childhood in Spokane, Washington. Lumberton is a real name. There are many Lumbertons in America. I had to pick a real town so we could get police insignias and stuff. But then the name Lumberton took off in my mind, and we started getting lumber trucks going through the frame, and that jingle on the radio, all that came out because of the name. Okay, he goes off on a tangent, but the tangent is wonderful, right?
But the tangent is... like, it's so important to his thing. It's one of the things that where you can definitely find, because, even though, I was not in film classes, when you're taking an English degree, like, movies are such an important part of, like, modern culture, it ends up becoming part of the conversation. So we've talked about Lynch stuff in some of the classes I've been in, and always there's like that section of people in academia that want to take whatever sort of, like, and I think it's sort of, there's a similar split in literary criticism that you're talking about with, like, the film theory versus film criticism stuff, of people that want to take the theory and use it as this key that unlocks the story and tells you what it is. And that's where, like, the psychoanalytic Freudian reading of, like, whatever. And there's, like, people who have this desire of taking that to Hamlet and, like, the scene between Hamlet and Hamlet's mother in her bedroom and be like, this is the secret of this movie. Like, if you take this and take a Freudian perspective on this, it unlocks everything about these character motivations and what the scene is speaking about. And this is what the whole play is really about this. And it answers, like, it sort of poses the work as a question, and then this theory is the thing that gives you the answer to what that question is. And I've never really liked that interpretation of stuff, and it's something when you have things like different pieces of media that feel like influenced by that critical sort of approach, you get stuff that's like Fight Club or something that I find very unsatisfactory, that sort of feels like it exists as a way of, like, where it's a question where you already had the answer of that theory, and then you have now written the work as a question that sort of prompts that answer.
Fight Club wants you to connect all the dots.
Exactly. And what, like, David Lynch and most of his work, like all of his works do, is just like, it's a complete antithesis to that kind of approach, because not everything has that answer. Like, there's not like that, the lumber thing is not just like it doesn't represent a dick, like that's not what it is. It's just this, like, interesting aesthetic choice that it's so much, and it's something that I think, like, it makes so much sense when you learn that he came from a visual arts background and being a painter. That's like, it's like so many of the visual elements in his movies and a lot of his narrative elements in his movies are there to put you in a mood, not there to, like, signal some sort of, like, deep seated thing. And you can approach and, like, try to understand elements of, like, different characters. Like, the Freudian psychoanalytics is a very useful frame to try to kind of approach the character of Frank Booth and use the tools of that to kind of understand some of the stuff that's going on there. But it does not answer Frank Booth. It is just something that you can use to dig deeper into that character. But the thing about David Lynch's works is, like, there is no answer sitting there. Like, that's why you can't ever define those boundaries, because if you could define those boundaries, you could ask that question. But none of his works just ask this question. They are so much about the mood and flow and tone of it, and just, like, sitting in there and getting into that weird dream space that he works in.
Absolutely. And there is a corner of academia and the internet that does like to play the symbolism game with David Lynch, and I find it so funny.
Yeah, it is, like, funny and tedious.
Funny and tedious, but I legitimately, like, I remember seeing Mulholland Drive for the first time. Actually, so I was in a film class. I was TAing that class, so I was actually the quote-unquote adult in the room. I was younger than a lot of people there, but I was the authority figure in the room in this lecture hall, and we watched Mulholland Drive. And I had not seen it before, and this movie had been hyped for me most of my life, and I'd heard all these things about it, and then I started watching it, and that was the moment when I fully fell in love with David Lynch, and it's still maybe my favorite Lynch film. But, like, Mulholland, and I should say, before any of this, I find David Lynch's films and TV shows and everything intensely funny. Yes. Like, I laugh at Lynch movies harder than I laugh at most comedies.
Yeah.
Blue Velvet is really dark in some scenes. It is an incredibly funny movie in some moments. Like, again, Kyle MacLachlan's whole thing about Heineken in the bar with Laura Dern is so funny. And some of Frank Booth's moments are so funny. Because Lynch has this slightly off-kilter way of looking at the world where his sense of humor, I just think I am, like, chemically on that wavelength. And I find his movies so funny. And Mulholland Drive is a very, very funny movie if you've ever seen it. And I remember the rest of the audience is big, lecture hall. It's a class all film students have to take. So there's like 200 people in there. A lot of them, normal college-age kids.
Yeah.
And probably haven't seen a movie like this before. And like 10 minutes into the movie, I start laughing because I realize this is really funny. Like the way he asks Naomi Watts to do her performance of like the ultra archetypal, stereotypical ingenue from the 1950s. Right. It's really funny. Naomi Watts is giving a great comedic performance in that movie. And I start laughing. And because, again, I'm the TA in the room, that gives signals to other kids in the room to start laughing.
Right.
And it becomes the whole room starts laughing. And by the end, we are all enjoying the movie so much. And then I enjoy just kind of sticking around and listening to different pockets of students talk about the movie. And like, that was so crazy when that happened. And I think that's the kind of conversation I love hearing about Lynch of, it's okay to just have the fun conversation of, man, when he brought in the midget to dance, that was weird. And you actually don't have to go further with that if you don't want to. That's still substance to me.
Yeah.
And so it's funny. But then I remember, because I've seen all the, around the internet over the years, the articles trying to explain Mulholland Drive.
Right.
And because Mulholland Drive, of course, came out, it was Lynch's first kind of internet era movie. And
is that like 2001 or
2001.
Something? Yeah.
And if you want a good laugh, watch Mulholland Drive and then read the Wikipedia page. It is by far the longest Wikipedia page for a single movie I've ever seen in my life. Great. It's reams of paragraphs on trying to explain the different themes of the movie. And I'm not saying you can't write reams on that movie. That movie has so much to pick apart. But if you're specifically trying to do the thing of like, this is where the dream starts, and this is where the dream ends, and the blue key unlocks reality, and then this is a bit. What I imagine is David Lynch on his laptop looking at that and cackling with glee because that's probably what he wanted on some level, is people to tie themselves into knots trying to explain something unexplainable. And to me, Mulholland Drive is the best movie maybe ever made on dream states because it never specifically tells you you're in a dream.
Yeah.
And that's the only way you can actually fully explore dream states, is if you don't know you're in one. Because when you're in a dream, you never know you're in a dream, right?
Yeah, and it's like it's when you're getting into Lynch, I think like the most important thing that people need to sort of learn, because it's something like the first time I watched some of his stuff, like I didn't totally get it. I think Twin Peaks was the first thing I saw where like I totally sort of got the mood and how to approach it. Is this totally just go with the flow? Do not watch the Red Room sequences in Twin Peaks and be like, well, they're talking backwards because that represents da-da-da-da, and the midget man represents da-da-da-da-da, and that's like, and the reason why Dale Cooper talks normally is da-da-da, and like try to like, because he wants to fuck his mom or something. Like that's not, because of course it's always going to come out of that, it's going to be that, or like something about dicks, it's going to be something about that. And if you're trying to do that, you're going to work yourself into such a sweat trying to like rope all these pieces together and try to like make sense of it. Don't do that. Just go with the flow, man. Just ride the fucking wave and enjoy the weird sort of sensory experience of watching his stuff.
Yeah, because, in dreams, you just have synapses firing and random things from your life coming together in ways that sometimes are intensely meaningful and sometimes not. And what Lynch gets in these movies and in his works is that to fully portray that, you have to have the non sequiturs too.
Yeah.
Like there is an amazing non sequitur sequence in Mulholland Drive where Justin Theroux's character is hearing this story about a guy in a diner and this thing he saw. It has nothing to do with anything else in that movie. It is an amazing sequence, and it is the kind of non sequitur that like builds the atmosphere of that movie so well.
Yeah.
And so I'm not saying don't talk critically about David Lynch.
No.
I'm saying there's so much to talk about, but talk about what it made you feel, like
Yes.
what you got out of that, like what connections you made, when the synapses fire while watching it, where do they go for you? That's what's interesting. You and I have talked before about how, like, if you read the works of, like, Freud or Jung, like, 2/3 of their stuff is fascinating and beautiful and helps you understand the human condition. And then there's the third about fucking your mom. You kind of just have to look aside.
Yeah.
David Lynch exists in the 2/3.
Yes.
And I think he kind of endorsed the 1/3. Not entirely. There is a very Oedipal thing going on in Blue Velvet in a lot of ways. But it's also not as reducible as, Jeffrey and Frank were afraid of their penises when they were boys, and so now they want to fuck their moms, blah, blah, blah. It's not just that, and I love that. So there's a long way of introducing Twin Peaks, but I actually think the context is important.
No, absolutely.
Because what Twin Peaks does, and why it is the Lynch thing that has the most mainstream penetration, is it packages all of that, in part due to Mark Frost being someone who has more experience in like episodic storytelling and stuff, in a way that it's almost like the Trojan horse version of that.
Right.
That there is a very like concrete mystery. There is a much more recognizable structure. I don't actually think Twin Peaks, that makes it less weird than other Lynch works. I think that's still all there.
Yeah.
It's just in a structure where, you know, I could probably get my mom to watch Twin Peaks at some point, and at some point she might still check out. But she'd at the beginning at least be like, I recognize this, and that's kind of the brilliance of Twin Peaks.
Yeah.
So let's talk about Twin Peaks.
Okay. How?
And actually, before we jump into that,
Okay.
the one last thing from Blue Velvet.
All right.
Just because I love this quote so much. It's from the scene where Jeffrey and Laura Dern's character, they're, you know, getting milkshakes at a 50s diner or something together. They're one of those very idealistic 50s settings that's in Blue Velvet. And Jeffrey's explaining why he's going on this weird pervy journey to her. And he says, I'm seeing something that was always hidden. I'm involved in the mystery. I'm in the middle of a mystery, and it's all secret. And she says, you like mysteries that much? And he says, yeah. You know, you're a mystery. I like you very much. That's Twin Peaks. That conversation is the entirety of Twin Peaks in 3 sentences.
Yeah.
I really think that, because that is the allure and the attraction of being in a mystery, and somehow it leads to these very profound emotions of love.
Yeah.
Twin Peaks is kind of that, because it is, and you know, Mark Frost and David Lynch will both always say that the starting point for Twin Peaks is they had this vision of a girl winds up on a shore wrapped in plastic, and what happens when you unwrap it.
Yeah.
And that is the whole point. It is ostensibly a murder mystery, but it is about these psyches, these fragile psyches of all these people in this small town, as explored by this wonderfully eccentric FBI agent, and that this mystery becomes this thing that lights this fire under this town, and it leads people to intense sensations of love and of fear and of mania and all these other things, and that's the engine that drives the whole show.
Yeah.
And, you know, that's why Twin Peaks opens every episode with a theme song that is this beautiful, aching, tender love song, basically.
Yeah. Yeah, it could be the name of the song is Falling in Love.
Yeah.
You know, it's pretty straightforward about what it's about.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, it's something where... Yeah, like talking about Twin Peaks, it's a really big subject to tackle. But like for me, one of the most interesting things of approaching Twin Peaks is something I always like doing, even though it's a ridiculous process, is like looking at genre stuff and like trying to understand how things fit into genres, what genres are. And it's a like incredibly dull semantic thing to do, but I love doing it. And it's something that's really fun to do, is then to go on the internet and see what other people's interpretations are, because they're always like... and I think everyone's always going to think this about other people's definitions of genres. They're always 100% fucking wrong and so off base. But for me, Twin Peaks, what makes Twin Peaks work and what I love about it, but then also what is like the downfall of Twin Peaks once it loses itself in season 2, is it's this insane concoction of 3 different, very different genres all put together, and it's like this incredible like triangle or house of cards, and all the parts are so important, and they need to be all in sync with one another and inform and build off of one another to make Twin Peaks work. And like when that doesn't work, it just becomes like weird, and just like not weird in a fun way, weird in like a, this doesn't really make any sense, this isn't scanning for me anymore, like this is like a bunch of sort of chaos in different directions that isn't sort of like confluencing together to make something bigger. And for me, like the 3 genres are, like you said, there's the murder mystery, where you have Laura Palmer, just like, you know, her body sort of washes up on shore, wrapped up in plastic, in this small, you know, mountain town in America, in the Northwest, and that sort of sets off all this stuff. And one huge, like, sort of thread of the show is Special Agent Dale Cooper from the FBI coming into this small town to investigate this young girl's death. It's a story you've seen a billion times in, you know, murder mystery fiction that is, like, you know, one of the foundations of American fiction of the 20th century, of, you know, small, like person dies, like, detective comes in, solves the mystery. There's God knows how many hours of television and film and like reams of pages have been written with that basic setup. And so you have that side of it. But then also you have the soap opera, which is a huge part of what Twin Peaks is. And that's where you're talking about where that death of Laura Palmer sort of like is this like this inciting catalyst that then sends all these like shockwaves and like ripples through the community and all these cracks in the community that where you see now into the personal lives of all these different people, all of whom have been touched by Laura Palmer very directly or in indirect ways, and her death sends them into very different directions, and that gives you this sort of like glimpse into their very melodramatic soap opera lives where they're falling in love, and there are like, you know, cousins that look exactly like their other cousin because it's played by the same actress, so they're practically, they might as well be like it's the good twin or whatever. And you have like the ex-con husband who just got out of jail, who's coming back into town, and all of that stuff that's like very over the top melodramatic soap opera stuff. And then you have the last pillar, which is, I think you can either call it surrealism. I think of it as magical realism more for Twin Peaks, because I think it goes a little bit too distinctly into the supernatural as opposed to the sort of the purely psychological, where to me that's the distinction I draw between surrealism and magical realism. Surrealism is when the boundaries between reality and like physical reality and psychological reality or dream reality are indistinguishable, and magical realism is when the boundaries between physical reality and or like the natural world and the supernatural world are no longer distinguishable. And to me, like Twin Peaks is more in that camp.
Yeah, and I would say that's maybe the biggest difference if you want to draw a line between like Twin Peaks and other Lynch works, is he often operates very much in the surrealist mode. Twin Peaks, you're right, much more falls into, I think, the magical realist is the right way to say it.
Yeah, because it's like, you know, the sort of dream visions that Dale Cooper has with the Red Room are not just dreams, they are also visions, whereas in like the dream scenes in Blue Velvet, those are dreams. Like he's like, Jeffrey is not having some vision and like gaining information from those about like concrete facts that then he like enters into like the real world and is able to like use those in the ways that in like Twin Peaks, Dale Cooper, like he's clearly contacting something else than just himself.
A great one is Eraserhead. There's the woman in the radiator, which is very much like the Red Room. It's not clear whether that's real or not.
Yeah.
It's not a vision. It's not a dream. It's all of the above.
Yeah.
Yeah, so that's where I would...
Yeah, so anyway, so that's... And, you know, anyone can have whatever fucking opinions they want to have on whether or not that's magical realism. In looking around online to see, like, how other people felt about this stuff last night, I stumbled across the worst interpretation of magical realism I've ever seen, which was people trying to argue that fucking Harry Potter was magical realism because it's set in more or less the real world, but there's a lot of magic stuff in it. It's like, no, it's like the opposite of magical realism in some ways, because what is real and what is magic is so clearly delineated in Harry Potter. Every single book starts with him in boring, normal Muggle world, and then he goes off to happy magic land, you know?
Yeah, no, I mean, magical realism, something I'm sure people who listen to this have seen. Hayao Miyazaki is my magical realism.
Sure, yes. Yeah.
My Neighbor Totoro, that kind of stuff, that is magical realism.
Very much so.
It's the casual entrance of magic onto the real world, not so much a clear delineation between the two. You know, Labyrinth is not magical realism. No. That's she goes to another world.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. So anyways, that's sort of like the magical realism bit, and that's to me that is like my favorite part of Twin Peaks is. It's like that incredibly delicate balance, and again, that's where in season 2 I think they really lose it at some point of like, what the fuck is going on with like the Red Room and like these weird like, you know, Laura Palmer's mom is seeing Killer Bob in places and stuff like that, and like Bob's presence as a whole in the show. It's like that's so. It's just strange and totally unexplainable, and yet somehow it makes sense to you. Somehow, even though it's utterly unexplainable, that stuff does not follow any sort of laws of logic or like physical reality. It feels like it so is in tune and meshes with everything else that the show is. And keeping all three of those genres intact and having them build on each other and inform one another and have them affect one another is what Twin Peaks is to me. And that's why, like, when that balance falls apart, it can be kind of excruciating, because it's like, if you're overemphasizing on the soap opera stuff that is no longer touching the investigation or no longer touching like the weird visions or whatever, it's just like, oh, like this dude's just like thinks he's a Civil War general for like 5 episodes. It's like, holy shit, this is just so going off on its own thing.
And we'll talk more about season 2 later, because I prepared stuff. I have my ranking of the top 10 worst things in season 2, and that's how we'll discuss all of those. But no, if you want to jump to kind of the point where the show falls apart a little bit, I think it's because they knock out one of the pillars.
Yes.
And the other two, it just comes out, and that's the murder mystery.
Yeah.
And one of the other books I read for this, it's called Reflections. It's an oral history of Twin Peaks. Was published a couple years ago. David Lynch is really the only super significant person who didn't talk for it. I think Laura Flynn Boyle didn't either, but Lynch did not talk for it. But everyone else is in that book, and it's a really interesting oral history of the show. It dismisses the movie at the end, and I don't like that. But other than that, it's a very interesting look at behind the scenes the show. And they will talk about that all over the place, of like that they believe that too, that it was Mark Frost and David Lynch were both really hardcore on this, that the mystery could not be solved until a certain point, because then you knock out that pillar of the show. But they also had, and spoilers for Twin Peaks, so I'll just say that.
Yeah.
It's a 25-year-old show. But, frankly, I had it spoiled for me before I saw it. It doesn't matter.
Yeah, no, I like also in like looking up online on Twin Peaks when I was first watching the show, like I saw the like who killed Laura Palmer. It's like fucking whatever. Like that doesn't tell you anything about the show.
Yeah, and I do want to go more in depth on that series of episodes in the middle of season 2 where they solve the mystery in a little bit. But what I just want to say here is that I think David Lynch and Mark Frost, they were told they had to solve the mystery by ABC. But they also very much had an idea in mind of how do you solve the mystery without actually solving it, which is where Killer Bob comes from, in that maybe you could do something where, all right, Leland's body killed Laura Palmer, but does that really tell us, like, the existential mystery almost, of, like, that really doesn't solve for you why or how or all these other things, that they could continue past that. And I think for any number of reasons, it's not done as artfully as it could have been to keep that alive.
Yeah.
And so really what happens is that mystery goes away completely, and the back half of season 2, mainly why it's so rough is there was nothing really to replace that. Wyndham Earl doesn't count.
No.
Because it's not a mystery.
No.
And 2, it's not good. Put those in whatever order you want.
Yeah.
But so then it's just soap opera and magical realism. And those two don't go together without that third ingredient.
No.
And
so it ends up swinging so hard in both directions where it's like, it's almost like it kind of stops being magical realism to me at some point, where it's like too blatantly fantastical and too like, it defines the boundaries between the magical world and the real world too hard and sort of loses that track. And then we will get to where the soap opera stuff goes off track later.
And I also don't want to fall into the trap of like blaming the other people working on the show for that, because and I'm not going to go into restating all of the history of the show. You can read that book, you can watch the special features and stuff. David Lynch and Mark Frost were less involved in the back half of season 2, but that's not the easiest answer for that. The other writers on that show were very talented. That show had, you look at the list of directors on that show, and it is a murderer's row of phenomenal, what we would now consider cable TV directors.
Right.
And sometimes feature directors. And, they all did their best, but part of that is just, they were put in that position too of how do we continue the story past Laura Palmer's death? The best writer in the world, I don't know, could do that perfectly because the show kind of cut one of its legs off. And so, but...
And even if it hadn't, Twin Peaks is not a show that, needs 30 episodes,
No.
It's something that, we're getting, 18 new episodes, and, that's kind of the right number. That's about as much as I think you can do. At some point, it is not a format. It's not like Doctor Who. It's not like X-Files. It's not fucking Law & Order. It's not a format that's sort of, you can just keep on doing over and over and over again and get more and more out of it. It is something that I feel like at some point needs to stop, because the more you explore those things, the more you're just solving the questions, whereas that's not what it's about. It's not answering those questions.
And I have a whole assertion that I will put out later that I think there's a specific episode where I would end the show, and it's not the one you're thinking of, that I think you could end it there and it would be a perfect show.
Okay.
But anyway, we'll talk about that later. But let's talk about the show from the beginning.
Okay.
So season 1 is a pilot plus 7 episodes.
Yes.
And I'll just say, let's quickly talk about the issue of episode titles.
Okay.
Twin Peaks does not actually have episode titles. On Netflix it does. Those were made for a German broadcast. No one involved with the show made those titles. They were weirdly translated back into English. They change depending on where you're looking at them. Those are not reliable. The way they're technically titled is there's the pilot, and then every episode after that, by Lynch and Frost's assertion, is episode 1, episode 2, just numbered throughout that. So that's kind of how I know them, because that is how the creators like to annotate them.
Okay.
And then it is also just weird that you can kind of say one of the weird titles that are maybe on Netflix or something, but that will not get you to that episode night, every single time.
Right.
Because they're not universal. So people might not know that, because I know Netflix, I wish Netflix would at least do the actual official title of the episode, which is episode 1, and then maybe slash and do the German title
Sure,
or whatever.
yeah.
Just because it gets a little confusing when you're trying to look those up. Because like in scholarly notes and stuff, you would use the title that Lynch and Frost intended, which, in keeping with the weirdness of the series, has weird stuff like, my favorite episode of Twin Peaks is episode 2, which is the 3rd episode.
Right, yeah.
Which is a great way to put this. But anyway,
Yeah.
the season 1 is the pilot plus 7 episodes. And it's just an amazing season of TV.
Yeah, it's
And
unbelievable.
if you look at the history of it, Lynch and Frost and everyone involved were pretty sure the pilot wouldn't become a show, so they were like, let's just do whatever we want. And then they were pretty sure the show wouldn't get aired or picked up for season 2, so they're like, let's just do whatever we want.
Yeah.
And they had the time to make it because the pilot was shot a good year before anything else. And then they only had 7 episodes to do after that, so they were able to write all 7 before they shot a second of it. So, it is, for that time period, even for just network TV today, an unusually well-crafted season of television, just in terms of there's almost nothing that doesn't work in that season.
It's very, even for as sprawling a show as Twin Peaks is in its scope, in like the size of the cast and everything, it is like a laser focused season of television where it's like there's not a hair out of place. Like everything has its purpose in the grand scheme of Twin Peaks in terms of building the tone and the feel of the show, and there's not like a subplot I would cut out of at season 1 anywhere.
No, even the stuff that's like, for instance, the soap opera stuff at the Sawmill has never been my favorite thing in Twin Peaks,
Yeah.
and I think it spiraled very far out of control in season 2. I like it in season 1.
Yeah.
It's not my favorite part of it, but it's essential in a lot of ways because that's the most soapy the show goes, and it's such an important ingredient.
Yeah, and it's something I like about the Sawmill being this even though most of the characters don't really interact with that side of the show, it always feels like that's like the core of the town. Like the town exists because that sawmill exists, and that's why it's important.
And it's why it's actually a good ending for that season. That season 1 ends with it going in flames.
Yeah.
But no, season 1 is so great. And let's talk about the pilot.
Yes.
I believe the pilot of Twin Peaks is the best pilot made for American TV ever.
Yeah,
and I
I
actually
would agree
think
with that.
a lot of people would agree with that.
Yeah.
Because there are plenty of great American TV pilots to this day, back in the past. Pilots sometimes are bad, but oftentimes pilots are great because you have the time to put into them and you have more resources, and sometimes you can get a great feature director to come on board or something. But Twin Peaks has such a great pilot where either in its original broadcast form or the special international version, which explicitly makes it a 2-hour movie, it's just a good movie. Mm-hmm. And it's open-ended. It's setting stuff up for a series to come. But it is just a great 90 minutes of cinema, whether you define that as being televisual or cinematic.
Right. Yeah.
Because one of the most remarkable things about that pilot to me, when I rewatched it recently, is you forget Dale Cooper is not introduced until 40 minutes into that pilot. He's only in the back half of it, really. And he's not even really the main figure in that pilot. And that speaks to how rich the show is around him, that you can have... before you get kind of the broader comedy that Cooper brings along with him, because his introduction is one of the funniest scenes in TV history, where he's just talking to Diane and being like, I love the smell of these oaks, or something,
Douglas firs.
Yep,
Yeah.
It's so great. You have 36 to 40 minutes of kind of some of the rawest emotion that had probably been presented on TV up to that point, where, you start with the great Jack Nance saying, lonesome foghorn blows. Yeah. And she's wrapped in plastic.
Yeah.
And I love that. And of course, everything.
There's a fish in the percolator. It's maybe the best line ever said in American TV ever.
Jack Nance is so great. I love that guy. He died a couple years after Twin Peaks. And it's so sad because he and Lynch had so much more they could have done together.
Yeah.
He's so great. Anyway, but yeah, you start there and you have... one of the things that really struck me when I watched the pilot this time is the quality of the filmmaking throughout, but particularly in the scene where Sheriff Truman comes to the hotel, whatever that's called.
The Great Northern.
The Great Northern. And Leland is there doing the thing with the Norwegians, which is the whole thing. And so Leland's out in the lobby, and he gets this phone call from Mrs. Palmer, Sarah Palmer. Yeah. And it's like, Laura didn't come home, and she's kind of freaking out, and Leland is trying to say, well, she's probably here or whatever. And at this point, all you know is that these are two parents of a daughter. You don't have the sense of who Leland is yet or anything. And Sheriff Truman comes walking up, and the scene becomes mostly nonverbal, and just there's a long shot that is on Leland in the foreground, and then you have the door of the Great Northern in the back, and it's Truman coming in, and so you see the tragedy like walking up, and then it's all through Ray Wise and Michael Onteen's performance as Truman, as they kind of have this quiet dance of he's coming to say your daughter died, and Sarah realizes it over the phone, and this unbridled like emotional outburst that comes out of it, but it builds so organically. And it is such a powerful sequence. And it's those first like 30 minutes of the pilot are important because there's this kind of emotional buy-in that, the show will get very silly and very heightened in a lot of ways, but at the cornerstone of it is this town ripped apart by this thing. Because you also have, there's a lot of characters just breaking into tears in this first 30 minutes. Like in the school where you have a very similar sequence where Donna figures that out and stuff like that.
Yeah.
And just all of the filmmaking around that, it's just good filmmaking.
Yeah, it's really good filmmaking, and it's that thing that, like, I think is one of the core things that keys you in about how different Twin Peaks is immediately, even though it's not, like, nothing about it is weird. Like the opening of the pilot, it's not, like, showing you some crazy bullshit that, like, tells you, it, like, really is that Trojan horse where you don't know, like, even you have, a little bit of weird stuff later into the pilot where, like, Sarah Palmer sees some, like, Killer Bob shit in the background and stuff, but it's, like, not forefronted much, as she has the vision at the end is maybe the weirdest thing, but it's not really till episode 2 that, like, Twin Peaks really tips its hand into the, like, totally bizarre stuff. And the pilot, the first 30 minutes of the pilot are just you watching the effect that Laura Palmer's death has had on this community, which is something that when you're looking at it from the soap opera side, that's like setting up everything about the soap opera side. But then also it's one of those things where having those different genres sort of building up and playing off of each other benefits them so much, as like the murder mystery helps give structure to a lot of the soap opera stuff, but also the soap opera stuff gives so much impact to the mystery and the murder of you spend so much time learning about and like feeling the impact that her loss has on this society before you get introduced to any like sort of impulse of, okay, now let's figure out who did it, because that's where once Dale Cooper comes into the scene, that's where he comes in and he starts figuring that stuff out. But before that point, there's no investigation going on yet. And most murder mysteries are the girl dies and then, immediately it's like, okay, let's figure out who it is. And then through the process of figuring out who the killer is, that's where you kind of find out who the victim was. And that process is here in Twin Peaks, but it's so much front loads that emotional backbone and so much front loads that punch of you learning who she was, learning who her family is, learning who her friends were, and learning all of that before you have any impulse at all to try to figure out who the killer is.
Yeah, and going off that point you made about, that the show does not foreground its weirdness, it's actually true of a lot of Lynch stuff. Like, the pilot to Twin Peaks is very much Blue Velvet-esque, I think, in the sense that it's more that things are kind of off-kilter a little bit here and there than they are outright bizarre.
Right.
And Blue Velvet does have its outright bizarre stuff here and there, but it's also a lot of it is just like, this is an Americana that doesn't quite feel right.
Right.
And you get that in Twin Peaks a lot, too, that, like, this doesn't quite feel right, and it's supposed to because this town isn't quite right. And, you start learning that with this girl who was, as David Lynch likes to say, radiant on the outside but broken on the inside. And, so there's that foregrounding of it, and then we get Dale Cooper. And we should just talk a couple minutes about the greatness that is Special Agent Dale Cooper.
Yeah, he's just one of my favorite characters, just straight up. He's so... Because I think one of the things I love about him is I feel like we're saying this about everything, because it's like just so true throughout all of David Lynch's stuff, is like he's really weird and eccentric, but not in ways you expect, and like not in ways that feel like he's this like character. Like there's something about him that feels also, he's weird and eccentric, but he also feels very grounded in some ways. Like he's not... And I think the thing that helps that is that he's this like really optimistic, cheerful person, which is so against the type for the detective character, for like the brilliant detective. So much you get, and it makes sense. And I'm not saying like those characters are bad or anything, but the typical one, that like the brilliant detective character, is they're really saddled with cynicism and like maybe like guilt about some trauma in the past. There's like something bad happened in their past, and they're like really standoffish. They insult people. They're very aggressive, and like, or they like they're Sherlock Holmes. That they ignore like social cues and stuff. But here, Dale Cooper is like, no, he's super cheerful. He's super optimistic. He's like, greets everyone with a smile and a firm handshake. And
he takes pleasure in everything.
Exactly.
There is nothing too small to cause him pleasure.
Yeah.
Like, a damn fine cup of coffee. Or he goes on and on in his first scene driving up the road about the cherry pie at this motel he found off the side of the road.
Yeah.
And it's just he takes so much pleasure in those small things, and you just sense that he moves through the world and kind of can make anywhere his home.
Yeah.
It's actually one of the things I don't like about the back half of season 2 is that they make it too much like, oh, Dale Cooper wants to just move to Twin Peaks and all this stuff. And it's like, as much as he loves this place, I don't think that's him. I think he probably falls in love with every place he goes to, and Twin Peaks is one of them. But yeah, he finds this bright ray of sunshine in everything, and he can feel the sadness and the darkness and all that. But he kind of brings this curiosity about the world that is fundamentally positive with him wherever he goes.
Yeah, and there's something about that makes him feel so real. And like it's like, as eccentric a character as he is, a lot of times like he feels weirdly sort of underplayed in some ways and like weirdly subtle. It's like it's kind of hard to grasp. Because it's like nothing about the way that Kyle MacLachlan plays him feels like super over the top or anything. He's not that, and there's not, he doesn't have like this really iconic look to him. He doesn't have like a coat or something that you like is like, oh yeah, that's like the iconic Dale Cooper coat. He's not eccentric in those ways. He seems so normal, but he's just off kilter enough in a couple of ways that you just get really attracted to the guy.
Yeah, Kyle MacLachlan is so good.
So good.
It is the most transparently like a David Lynch stand-in Lynch I think has ever used. Like Blue Velvet definitely, but I think even more here because Kyle MacLachlan and Mark Frost talks about this because Mark Frost did more of like the day-to-day writing on the show, that they just wrote Cooper as David Lynch. Like he's got the speaking patterns and all this, like to the point where Lynch wouldn't even really recognize they were doing that, I don't think. But they just kind of like his whole Tibet monologue in episode 2, which is so beautiful. I can so easily imagine Lynch just going off on that tangent in an interview, right?
Yes.
That is something he would do.
It's like, I'm going to talk to you about the country of Tibet. And then everyone leans forward in their chair.
Yes. Yeah, and he has that magnetic quality to him, too. Like that scene in episode 2, which is one of my favorite scenes in the whole show.
It's maybe the best scene in all of Twin Peaks. It's like the defining scene to me of that show in some ways.
Where they go out to this forest, and Lucy sets up the spread of donuts and coffee for them. And, they all get a warm up with their coffee, and they're so happy to get that. And then Cooper has set up this whole big blackboard and a bottle up on a log over there, and he's got some rocks, and he makes the Michael Horst character, what's his
Andy?
name? No, not Andy. Hawk. Hold the thing with like oven mitts, the thing of rocks, and he says, all right, let me tell you all about the country of Tibet. And the most off-kilter thing about that whole sequence is that no one else questions what he's doing. And you know why they don't? Because you wouldn't either.
No.
Because you are in the presence of Agent Dale Cooper, and you're going to go along with it.
Yes.
And somehow they get good evidence out of all of that big experiment they do where he tries to use his subconscious to see who the killer is, and it's a weirdly effective method.
And because it's like that scene is, I think, like the reason why I find that scene, like look at it as being like the Twin Peaks scene to me. It's like, it's when I watched it the first time, I went from being like, this show is really good to being like, this show is so special, was watching that scene. Because for me, that's where like that trifecta of the genre stuff like all clicks into place, because it's like you have the weird off-kilter soap opera kind of humor stuff and the character dynamics there that you would not find in a normal detective show, and you have like all the, but you have like this like actual methodical sort of investigative process going on of them going down this list of all these suspects. That I think is why it's like they all have the letter J or something in their name, and going down all of those and sort of like defining their relationship to Laura Palmer and sort of talking about that side of it. But then also has this weird magical realism part of it of then like the process of them going through this like list of suspects is him trying to use his subconscious or like this like spiritual connection he has to the world of throwing these rocks at the bottles every time a name is said, and if it's right, and like if there's a lead there, the rock will hit the bottle, and if it's way off base, the rock will go way off base and probably hit Andy in the face.
That's right.
And that's like all of those things interacted this like beautiful meld that's like you don't understand how anyone could have written a scene like this, because it seems like it should just completely fall apart and spin out of control from like a writing perspective. But it's everything is so in sync, and the humor and the investigative drama and the weird supernatural, like not quite supernatural, like weird spiritual element of that scene all of those things inform each other and build off of each other into like a scene that is much more powerful than if it focused on not even just any one of those, but on any two of those in conjunction.
Yeah. So okay, we were talking about the pilot, but I want to move past that a little bit because the pilot almost speaks for itself. We can go back and talk about scenes if we want, but I want to ask if you had the same experience I had, because it sounds like you did, where I watched the pilot and I thought, this is a masterful piece of filmmaking, but I wasn't necessarily in love with it yet.
Yeah, and especially like not necessarily like in love with the idea of watching the whole series based on just the pilot, because the pilot was like almost like it's sort of half designed to be is basically a movie.
Right. And then you have episode 1, which is a good episode, but it's also kind of a piece mover. Like, we have to get things going.
Yeah.
But it's very good. It has some great scenes in it. And then you get episode 2, which I think is like kind of the key episode of Twin Peaks.
Yeah, definitely.
And that's the episode where I fell in love with it.
Yeah.
Same thing for you?
Yes, definitely the same thing with me.
Because episode 2 has, among other things, it opens with the funniest scene in the show for me, which is the brie sandwiches, where Ben and Jerry... So Ben Horn, played by Richard Bamer, is having dinner with his weird family, including crazy Audrey and his weird son, his developmentally delayed son. Don't want to be mean to the son. And his wife, who I don't think likes any of them.
And who, like, that's like one of her 2 or 3 seasons she's in the show. Like, she, like, weirdly disappears and then comes back every once in a while and you forget that she existed.
And then Ben, or Jerry, his brother, because of course they're named Ben and Jerry, comes in with these brie sandwiches he got from his trip to Europe, and they start eating them. And it is it is so funny. And I have, I guess, a weakness for scenes where people eat food weirdly, because one of my other favorite comedy scenes of all time is in the movie What About Bob, where Bill Murray eats the corn.
Right, yeah.
It's so great. But like that scene and the way Richard Bamer just rips into it, and I could find the quote, but I don't think I need to. But the quote Richard Bamer always gives about that scene is David Lynch would tell him, okay, eat the brie and like you're really enjoying it, and he would like bite into it. And it wouldn't be enough, and Lynch would say, more! And he'd go further and further, and then finally he's like, well, I finally just got mad at David, and decided I'm just going to do a terrible take, and like went fully into it, and Jerry, or Ben goes crazy for a minute eating the brie sandwiches, and David's like, that's perfect, we got it! And I love it.
Yeah.
It is such a funny scene.
It's a really funny scene, but also, like, as with a lot of the humor in Twin Peaks, it also is used to sort of, like, really inform something about the character dynamics. So there's something that's so... Like, there's something so weirdly brutal about that scene of, like, Ben Horn is having dinner with his family, and it's obviously, like, it's a very cold, frigid sort of dinner with his family. But he's still eating it. It's like presumably like his wife made the food or something. And then his brother comes in out of nowhere with these, and this is the first time we've ever seen his brother. And he has these fucking sandwiches, and it has like all this story about how he got the sandwiches, gives the sandwich to Ben, and he just immediately starts eating the sandwich with like so much gusto, where he was like so timidly eating like the soup or whatever he was having before. It's like such a slap in the face to everyone else in the room that like he's just eating this great sandwich on his own, like in this like weird conversation just with his brother, not including anyone else in the room into that conversation. It says so much about who Ben Horn is, who his brother is, and like their relationship together, and how dysfunctional that family is, that like that scene can happen. But it's also ridiculously funny at the same time.
You really understand Audrey better when you see that scene.
Yes, yeah, it definitely, because also, episode 2 is where Audrey Horn as a character started really clicking for me, because she's also one of my favorite characters.
One of my favorites, and great backstory I learned from the oral history. Sherilyn Fenn came into audition, I think, for Donna, and they loved her, but she obviously wasn't right for Donna because Donna isn't a crazy person.
Yeah.
So they just wrote Audrey for Sherilyn Fenn because they thought we need her. So in the pilot, she has all these like non sequitur scenes where she's kind of just off on the fringes.
Yeah.
And then in episodes 1 and 2, they're like, well, let's give her a story, and that's where you start getting it. Other scenes in this episode, though.
Yeah.
The first scene of Leland dancing and breaking down, and I think the best of those.
Yeah.
Where it's Ray Wise, such an amazing performance throughout this show and the movie. But like that scene where he turns on the record player and he takes Laura's picture and he's moving around the room with it, and he winds up breaking the glass and all this stuff.
Yeah, and he cuts his, like, in, like, actual Ray Wise, cut his hand on the glass and, like, use that in the performance, which, like, one of, like, my favorite weird things in movies and TV shows is when actors get injured in the process of filming a scene and just, like, roll with it. It's just, like, makes me weirdly uncomfortable when I watch those scenes, and you realize that it's like, oh wait, no, that's his actual blood.
Yeah.
But also you're like, that's fucking so badass. Like he just was able to completely roll with that. That's crazy.
Yep. But then like, a commonality between that, like with Ray Wise there and Richard Bamer in the brie sandwiches scene, is that speaks to how David Lynch, I think one of the unique things he brings that other directors, again, not saying there are lesser directors, just different, is that he is able to get actors to go to places I don't think they would otherwise go, whether it's slightly more soapy than they would want to, or more heightened or something. And that's like, yeah, he can get Richard Bamer to go there with the brie sandwiches. He can get Ray Wise
to just go completely crazy in those dancing scenes.
And even in other episodes of Twin Peaks, when they're not directed by David Lynch, the actors don't quite go that far.
Yeah.
Like, they can't. I think there's just something about, and they all will speak to this in that oral history, that there's something about his presence on set, and it's not a domineering presence. It's not Stanley Kubrick shouting at people.
Yeah.
It's just something, kind of like you will follow Dale Cooper, you'll follow David Lynch in a weird way. All right, that episode also has Albert Rosenfeld, the Miguel Ferrer character.
Yes, Albert, he's so good. That, like, talk about the humor in this show. The Albert stuff is so funny.
The late, great Miguel Ferrer, who sadly passed away earlier this year. Actually, one of the great things about that oral history is that the author who did that got all those people on the record, a lot of them right before they died. It's got Catherine Coulson, it's got Michael Parks, who just died, it's got Miguel Ferrer, who just died, it's got a lot of the Twin Peaks cast has sadly passed away recently. And so you hear a lot from Miguel Ferrer. He's a cool dude. But yeah, Albert's such a great character. So Albert's in that episode. You got the whole Tibet lesson and the rock throwing, and then of course that episode ends with the Black Lodge ending, the Red Room. And have you ever seen the full international version of the pilot?
Yes,
you have. Mm-hmm. Okay, so let's talk about that because where that comes from is the pilot, because of weird financing things, because David Lynch often gets his financing from weird European companies. He had to deliver both the pilot as it would be broadcast on ABC and other channels around the world, and a 2-hour standalone movie version in case people just wanted to do the Twin Peaks movie but not the show. So basically they made it up as they went along and shot 20 minutes at the end to tack on to the end of the pilot to give it some kind of resolution. And I love that version of the pilot. It's amazing. Like, I would love to find someone who has never seen Twin Peaks and show them that and just tell them it's a movie.
Or like someone who saw that and then just like didn't know that it was ever a series. Like didn't know anything, but just like but like saw it years ago and be like, oh, by the way, did you know? This is this whole TV series. It was not just a weird TV movie.
Yeah, because when they did it different. It's edited differently in episode 2, where they have they cut down a lot of it and they make it more explicitly dreamlike because it is explicitly Cooper's dream. But I actually like those scenes even more in their original version, in the international version of the pilot. Because if you haven't seen it, what happens is it starts with Andy and Lucy at home together, where I guess in the show, they're not together yet, technically, but in that version of the pilot...
Really. It's sort of like vague.
The pilot makes it clear they're a couple. Or that version of it, because they're home together, they're about to go to bed, and Andy's playing the trumpet, because of course he is, and Lucy gets a phone call from Mike, the one-armed man, and asks Cooper to come to the hospital. And so a lot of the scenes you would recognize from the thing in episode 2 happen, but at full length, where Mike gives this long speech, and they meet Bob, who is an actual physical entity, and he's just got this ring of candles down in the basement of the hospital, and Mike shoots Bob in the head, and then it just abruptly cuts and says on screen 25 years later, and it's Cooper in the Red Room, and then from there it's the same ending you would know from the show, although without Cooper waking up at the end and snapping along to the music and saying, I know who killed Laura Palmer. Of course it can wait until morning. Which is one of my favorite TV cliffhangers ever, because it's just David Lynch and Mark Frost flipping off the audience in the best way possible. But I mean, watching it in the original pilot and seeing it as an actual ending is fascinating.
It's so because it's not like my favorite thing, because it's like it clearly it doesn't all it doesn't all work because it wasn't designed to work, but it does highlight that there is some alternate reality where Twin Peaks could have just if they had originally designed it just to be a movie, it could have been this amazing weird 2 to 2.5 hour movie that you could have done that. You could have kind of half resolved the murder and it had to actually be a totally satisfying conclusion.
And you know what? David Lynch did do that, because that's what Mulholland Drive is. Mulholland Drive was an ABC pilot because for some reason ABC said, we'll let you make a pilot again. Why not? Even though they didn't really like what he did the first time. And so he made Mulholland Drive as a pilot, and if you've seen Mulholland Drive, you know why ABC said no, because how would that ever air on American TV? And so he went back and shot an extra 40 minutes, and that movie is less narrative, so it works easier that way, but it's what makes that movie so great. You can imagine maybe if they had gone to that same level of effort on Twin Peaks, you could have had a similar thing.
Yeah.
Although I'd argue Twin Peaks is more explicitly setting up stuff to come.
Yes.
But it is fascinating just to have that alternate reality of what if it had just been a movie and Bob was just some skeezy guy in the basement of a hospital.
Yeah. But anyways, let's go back to the version of the scene as it is in episode 2.
Yes,
and
because
how it fits into the larger series.
Because definitely they make it work more as something that can continue on. Because they don't have Bob getting shot in the head.
No.
They make it much more explicitly a weird dream he's having. And, in that context, because that's how we both first saw this scene, I'm sure. The end of episode 2 and the Red Room and the backwards talk, even if you are watching it 25 years later in a culture that has, embraced that as ripe for parody and stuff, everyone from The Simpsons and Saturday Night Live and everyone else has done their versions of that scene. That scene is a mind trip.
Yeah, it's so... Because it's a thing where you can, parody and copy specific things of, the set, and you can, parody the backwards talking stuff and all of that. But, the thing that nobody else can capture is, the pacing of that scene and, the slow, just, because those scenes are both that scene and then with the other really huge Red Room scene at the very end of the show and stuff. They are long sequences that they are long in terms of the amount of time they take up in the episode, but then also in terms of you experiencing it. They feel so protracted and drawn out, but not in a bad way, not in a way that you feel bored, but you're just I feel like it's one of those things where it's playing off of dreams and stuff. Your perception of time and dreams is so distorted. I feel like it plays off of that. Instead of things being weirdly accelerated, it feels weirdly slowed down and you're just in slow motion when you're watching those scenes because it's so deliberate. The music is slow and soft and doom doom doom. It's the slow bass and everything is just red, and the weird deliberate movements that particularly all the actors in those scenes that are not Kyle MacLachlan have to make weird deliberate movements because their footage is being played backwards and stuff like that. So it's all of that just makes it so you feel all of a sudden the last 10 to 15 minutes of that episode are an hour long in your physical experiencing of time. I feel somehow I'm going to die sooner because I've watched Twin Peaks than by 30 minutes or something than I would if I hadn't.
But you're not angry about it.
No, it's time of my metaphysical existence on this world well spent.
Absolutely. Michael J. Anderson, who plays the man from another place, as they always credit him, is such a wonderful presence on screen.
One thing I loved, I think it was on the special features I watched of the Fire Walk With Me one, is he talks about in some interview that the talking backwards thing was something he did as a kid with his friends. And so when David Lynch asked him to do that, he's like, oh yeah, I can just do that.
And he's easily the best at it.
Yeah, no, he's really good.
He's really good at it, and it's such a unique skill because, Cheryl Lee has to do it, and at some point Frank Silva, who plays Bob, has to do it. Everyone has to do it at some point. But, he is always the best at it in that you can pretty much understand what he says, weirdly. But it's just, he's got this wonderful vocal quality for it. I actually learned reading the oral history, they didn't just play the film backwards. They shot it that way. They shot it backwards through the gate, and that's how they got it. So it doesn't exist in the other form, which I think is fascinating.
That's great.
Yeah, they just skipped that step. And so because of that, the film also ran upside down. So the DP on that scene, I forget his name because the pilot had a different DP than the rest of the show, had to be physically upside down to shoot that scene.
Great.
That is an amazing anecdote.
That's one of those just brilliant director sort of DP stories.
Yeah.
Okay, so that sort of makes sense when you say it.
Yeah.
That's I wonder how those conversations went on set when you're figuring out how are we going to watch this. Am I going to have to be upside down to fucking shoot this thing?
DPs are very dedicated to their craft, and he talks about it in the book of just that was the only way I could see what I was doing, was to be held upside down shooting this thing.
Great.
It's amazing.
That's great.
Yeah. But no, its placement in episode 2 is so wonderful because it gives you this, the show is getting a little weirder and weirder, and it gives you this wonderful injection. Cooper well enough at that moment to read this as a dream of his. And I specifically, the cliffhanger they do where he calls up Sheriff Truman and says, I know who killed Laura Palmer. Meet me at 7 a.m. here at the Great Northern. And obviously off screen, Sheriff Truman is probably saying, well, let's talk about it. He says, no, of course you can wait until morning.
Yeah.
And then he just starts snapping along with the music that he's somehow hearing.
Yeah.
Because I think both him and Audrey can hear the Angelo Badalamenti music.
Yeah.
Even though it's non-diegetic. they can both hear it and dance to it. And so can the man from another place.
Yes.
And that's and then episode 3 is actually is directed by Leslie Linka Glatter, who is one of the great TV directors, and I love that one too because like the first scene where Cooper is waiting in the Great Northern Diner, and Audrey comes up, and they have that whole freshly squeezed conversation, and then of course this whole conversation with Sheriff Truman and everything about all this. He's like, if we solve the symbols, we'll solve the mystery, which almost plays like 25 years too early a parody of how people would later read Twin Peaks, which is great. And that episode also has the funeral where Ray Wise, this was improvised, jumps in the casket and it keeps going up and down and up and down. And Bobby has that big blowout at the funeral. It's another great episode from season 1. So let's talk about we're not going to go episode by episode. But for the rest of season 1, what other things would you want to talk about? Because that's the last one Lynch did for that season.
Right.
But the next 5 episodes are still really good.
Yeah, I mean, like, that funeral scene is one of my favorites. Like, that one is always one that sticks out in my mind. Like, that's fascinating to find out that was improvised, because that feels like the casket going up and down. There's something that's, like, so... That feels like that would have had to have been planned or something. Like, it feels so perfect for Twin Peaks. I don't know. Like, I almost feel like we should, like, go down through characters, because I feel like that is what Twin Peaks is to me in so many ways.
Let's do that in a little bit. I want to say one more thing about season 1, just while we're talking about the episodes. Because then we're going to do this less with season 2. But the season 1 finale is my other favorite episode of that season, and that's the one Mark Frost directed. And I love the season 1 finale because it is so bonkers, batshit insane. Not in like the magical realist sense, but in that they basically are like, how can we set up the craziest cliffhanger possible for every character involved in this show? And they do it. They are so brazen about it. Of not only do they not solve the murder mystery, they blow up the whole show. And it's just down to the last shot is Cooper getting shot 3 times in the chest. Like, it's so out there ludicrous. It plays like the best parody of a soap opera while also earnestly being a good soap opera. And I love that about it. And I've always loved that episode. And I also dearly love the season 2 premiere where Lynch comes in to tile that up and does a great job with it. But like, that's just one I wanted to mention in terms of season, because the other stuff in season 1 all does kind of blend together for me in a good way. Because there's a lot of good stuff that happens. But yeah, let's talk about some of the characters, and then from that point, I have some other notes of things we can talk about. But what other characters do you want to mention?
Let's talk about Bobby. I like Bobby a lot. I feel like
Dana Ashbrook.
Yes, we haven't really talked about much that he's in yet.
Because there are all the kids. Like, one of the interesting things about the cast of Twin Peaks is almost all the adults were established actors, sometimes really famous. Like, Piper Laurie at the end of every episode. She plays Catherine Martell, and she's always credited as Piper Laurie as Catherine Martell, other than the part where she's credited as a Japanese man. That's a different thing.
Season 2.
Yeah, season 2. No, but... I don't actually know Piper Laurie that well, but I know she was like a big TV star coming onto that. Joan Chen had just come off of The Last Emperor, which was this big, Oscar-winning movie, and you have Ray Wise in there, and both Richard Beymer and Russ Tamblyn, who plays Dr. Jacoby, they were the stars of West Side Story.
Right.
You have a lot of famous people, and then you have all the kids who a lot of them are pretty well known now, but they were virtually unknowns. So you wanted to talk about Bobby. That is a fascinating character to me because he waxes and wanes in effectiveness to me because depending on kind of who's writing and stuff. But when that character is effective, he's so fascinating.
Yeah, and I feel like there's something about like Dana Ashbrook's portrayal of him that I love so much. And it's like it's him, and then it's also James, the biker. That like both of them feel like they somehow like they both make sense that they exist in 1990s America, but they are also like. They're fucking greasers. Like, they're greasers in kind of different modes, but they're both greasers. And it's like, there's something about, like talking about the West Side Story. Like, Bobby, particularly, I think, in the pilot, has this, like, physicality to him that feels like at any second he could just break out ballet dancing and I wouldn't bat a fucking eye. Like, he's not dancing or anything, but, like, he prowls around. I love, like, Dana Ashbrook has this great, like, tick that he gave the character of, like, zipping and unzipping the zipper on, like, his sleeve, and he does that all the time. And there's, like, this really kind of, like, feral quality to him that I just find so fascinating because it feels like it's one of those things of, like, with most of the characters in Twin Peaks, it's taking a concept and, like, that maybe you've seen this kind of character in places before, but it runs with it in such an over-the-top way of, like, like the Ray Wise, the grieving father character you've seen in every single murder mystery ever, but, like, most of the time the grieving father does not go fucking crazy and dance around with, like, the picture of his daughter or does not jump onto the funeral casket and all that stuff. And here, there's something about Bobby is so over the top in how, like, you know, in the moment he is, how much he just lives for, like, these, like, really sort of, like, base things that he lives for, like, wanting to get money and wanting, like, and love and sex and that stuff, and his relationship with Leo's wife, I can't remember her name. But
Shelley?
Like, yeah, Shelley. And, like, all of that stuff. He's so just ridiculously so far in the direction of, like, that kind of character archetype that, like, it becomes something almost transcendental to me. It's like he's so... works so well.
Bobby in the first season and in Fire Walk with Me, I love that character.
Yeah.
I think in the second season, he is one of the ones who suffers the most from like sanding the edges off him. Because I particularly think in Fire Walk with Me, and if you haven't seen the deleted scenes from that movie, his in that movie are phenomenal. Yeah. There's one scene in particular I almost wish was in the actual movie that he's in, where like that movie also shines a light on him in his relationship with Laura, where he is also he's also a drug addict. He's doing all this bad stuff, and he is just such this broken little kid inside.
Yeah, he's so insecure and vulnerable.
Yeah. And, you know, he's a violent, dangerous dude also, deep down, and I think the second season sands that off way too hard and makes him more of a comedy character. But I love when he's at that, when they have him in that right balance of that he is this kind of unhinged, ostensibly high school kid who looks like he's 30. You know, I don't know how old Dana Ashbrook actually was. He does not read as a high school anything, which is funny because he's also with Shelley, who does read as a high school student but isn't, which is bizarre. There's all the, you know, Madge and Amick. I, again, don't know her age at the time of filming that. She looks like a high school student, and she's one of the only ones who's not.
Yeah.
It's weird. But Bobby is a fascinating character, and I love his scenes in the pilot, particularly just how the weird way he grieves for Laura. Like, everyone does it in weird ways, and his is to just start lashing out at the world.
Yeah.
It's
just like, because there's something about him that, especially like when you like get deeper into his history with Laura in Fire Walk with Me, but I think it's something that's always present in that portrayal, particularly in season 1, is that sense of like Laura is definitely partially responsible for how he's fucked up, and you kind of get the read on that well before you see specifically how she's partially responsible for how he's fucked up. But there's something about just seeing him like that story of him like falling for this girl and then like but not knowing beforehand like how like what kind of world she's actually living in and getting dragged into it before he realizes what he's doing and then coming out the other side. Like, so like in the pilot, like feel like this really dangerous, violent person that like there's something really interesting about that character and that process of his transformation into that.
Yeah. You mentioned James too.
Yeah.
And he is kind of like the flip, the yin to Bobby's yang, if you want to call it that. I think James Marshall, the guy who played him, he's an interesting part of that show because I think sometimes he fits very well with what they're trying to do and sometimes doesn't.
Yeah.
And obviously they had no earthly clue what to do with him in the second season. Yeah. Sad. And that's not his fault.
Yeah,
but
I assume that's probably on your top 10 list is his whole subplot, and that's in season 2.
It's there.
Yeah.
Yeah. But, like, you know, I do think in season 1, we can talk about Donna here, too, the Laura Flynn Boyle character. I actually really like their romance. I think it's an interesting thing because it's one of the most overtly soapy parts, but I actually like it well into season 2 as well. I think they have some interesting stuff. One of my favorite scenes involves them in season 2. But, like, it is this weird thing where these two people who were so, like Laura's best friend and her actual boyfriend, because in Lynch World, everyone always has a real love and a hidden love, which is like the most Lynchian idea ever. And, you know, they wind up falling for each other. And there's some really, like, tender, interesting scenes. One of the scenes that has always stuck out in my mind hardest in the pilot, weirdly, is the one where they meet each other at night. And you've got the high comedy of Cooper and Sheriff Truman driving around trying to find them. But they are just out there in the woods because the woods represent something very, you know, primal to Twin Peaks, and they have this conversation, and they wind up, you know, burying the locket and all that. It's just a phenomenal scene. And I think they have this really interesting, tender chemistry where they do... You know who they feel like to me? They feel like James Dean and Natalie Wood out of Rebel Without a Cause.
Yes. Yeah,
almost too, like, really well. Like, they are characters from Rebel Without a Cause in Twin Peaks, and when that's done well, it's really interesting.
Yeah, and it's something that also their relationship, particularly in the pilot, is the thing that like I feel like most builds up kind of that sense of like who Laura Palmer actually was, particularly when you get the scenes of interrogating Donna and stuff and having the videotape of them and the picnic in the mountain and like that whole... It's another one of those things there's just the whole idea of that relationship I find really fascinating of Laura dating James, but probably like really knowing that Donna loves James, but like for whatever reason Laura Palmer's whole like existence is she cannot possibly maintain a functional relationship with anyone, and like completely unintentionally for like her traumas creates dysfunctional relationships in places where maybe they wouldn't have been in a lot of...
She also lashes out at anything that starts to become her. Yeah. So in Fire Walk with Me, you have that's one of my favorite sequences in any movie ever, where she takes Donna out reluctantly for that night on the town, and they go to that bar where the music is playing loud and everything's subtitled. And it's just, she keeps stopping Donna from like approaching anything that would be like her. So even if James and Donna together would be healthy, because she sees something of herself in that, she can't let it happen.
Yeah, it's that really fascinating dynamic that like is also like, again, it's really exaggerated, but it feels really, it's like the most high school aspect of the show to me is that idea of like, of all of these three kids together and they're all friends and two of them are dating, but like really the other two that aren't, or like the one that isn't dating is in love with the guy and like, but like he really loves her, like that dynamic feels, again, it's the most soap opera, but also there's something about it that feels very true to like, adolescent sexuality.
Yes, absolutely. Let's talk about Sheryl Lee for a second.
Yeah.
Because she has scenes as Laura in the pilot, and then she comes back in episode 3 as Maddie Palmer, her identical twin cousin, because that's how that works. Yeah. It's great. To me, other than Kyle MacLachlan, Sheryl Lee is the best performance in the Twin Peaks universe.
Especially once you get to Fire Walk with Me, for sure.
Absolutely. And, she was just a Seattle stage actress, because that's where they shot the pilot, and they thought, well, Laura's just a dead body in this one. We don't need an LA person flown out here. Yeah. So they didn't... She just really was hired to just be the body in the plastic bag, and David Lynch is such an instinctual filmmaker. He saw more in that character, and so she became a bigger and bigger part of the show until he made the whole movie about her. Yeah. But I think Sheryl Lee, who again in the show most of her stuff is as Maddie, who I think is a fascinating character, and it's actually my favorite thing about the entire second season is Maddie and how she interacts with James and Donna and everyone. All of that I think is fantastic. It's one of the only areas where I think the second season actually improves on the first, is where it takes some of those relationships because of how far they push Maddie and stuff like that. But Sheryl Lee also, consistently has scenes as Laura as flashbacks or videotapes, and she's such a fascinating actress because, again, she wasn't a film actress before this. Yeah. She doesn't feel like she comes in with the codes or conventions of how you would play those characters, and there's, because of that, a rawness and a reality to that character that really ties a lot of this show together.
Yeah, and it's something that it was just like such a weird sort of fortuitous thing to get her for a role that like they weren't trying to find anyone special for it, and just ended up finding an actress that's like uniquely talented and really, even in like the little bits that she is in the pilot, like you get this sense of like, it's particularly, I feel like I saw an interview that sort of talks about that the moment where David Lynch decided we're going to like find a bigger place for her on the show is when they were shooting the material for the VHS tape that they show in the interrogation scenes, where that's the most in the pilot you see of Laura Palmer ever being alive, and there's such a vitality to her in that scene, and like you really like get the sense of like, is she maybe a normal high school girl? And there's like something about like her performance in that like scene where it's like you see so much life and like brilliance and hope in her that really sells that side of the story, that then of like, how she like ties this community together. But then also all the stuff you're finding out about her is how she has this dark like under like belly to her of like that she's into drugs, and she's obviously like connected to really dangerous people in dangerous ways. Yeah, and that dichotomy is so much of the heart of Twin Peaks, and she embodies that so naturally.
It is interesting, and it's part of why I think, and we'll talk about this later, why we think Fire Walk with Me is so essential, is it's the missing piece that the show never got to do. Yeah. Because Laura Palmer is the town. She is... The more layers you peel back of her, the more layers you peel back of the town and all of its secret sins. Because as broken as she was, that's how broken the town and all its, subjugate parts are as well. There's all these different traumas going on. And, that first season, I think, does a really good job pacing that out of. For every secret you learn about Laura, you're learning 5 about, the sawmill and about the Great Northern and about, Leland's business and all these other things. And that's what makes it so compelling along the way. Even as you have these things that are actually very positive, like blossomings, like the James and Donna romance and things like that. So, which leads to them playing detective at the end of this first season, which I love and all that. But yeah, other characters we already mentioned: Sherilyn Fenn, Audrey.
Yeah.
Audrey's a great character.
Yeah, and like her relationship with Dale, particularly in season 1, I just find so interesting. And like it's adorable, but like it feels like it would have been very easy for that relationship to like fall apart and like not play very well because it's kind of weird, but it could like end up feeling very creepy in a lot of ways, but it ends up feeling the right amount of sweet.
It does, and it's a weird. We'll talk more about the character in general, but one of the pieces of Twin Peaks history is that when they decided in season 2 they're going to reveal Leland killed Laura and wrap all that up, they wanted to have the second half of that season be about Cooper and Audrey getting in a relationship, and Kyle MacLachlan vetoed it.
Yeah,
and there's a lot of theories why. He was dating Laura Flynn Boyle at the time, and there's theories that she didn't want him to do that and stuff. Whatever, and part of it was Kyle MacLachlan says in the oral history, look, I just didn't think Dale Cooper would date a high school student. And I think he's probably right on that.
Yeah.
And Heather Graham, who wound up being his love interest, Annie, she was younger than Sherilyn Fenn at the time, which, is weird. But she also wasn't specifically playing a high school student.
Yeah.
So there's different ways to read it. I am probably in the minority camp where I'm glad they didn't do that.
Me too.
I think maybe it could have worked, but I think it's a weird idea.
Yeah, I think it's like I'm glad that they didn't do that, but I also think like them having to have, because I just don't like really see a romantic arc for Dale Cooper at all. Like there's just something like that's one of the things in season 2 that never worked for me, even from a conceptual point, is trying to really build out that, because I think there's what I like about Dale and Audrey's relationship is like obviously Audrey has a huge crush on him, but really like she's looking for a friend that can help her and understand her, and Dale's the only person in the town that can do that, and I really like where that relationship develops of them just being friends, and I wish that they had like gone deeper into that relationship with those two characters, because in season 2 it just feels like they end up abandoning it and introducing Billy Zane out of nowhere.
They abandon Audrey's arc, which what makes her so interesting is that Sherilyn Fenn has this just wonderfully weird screen presence, and Audrey is such a fun character to have around and be a provocateur for all these different people, right?
Yeah,
and she can just go into this is also in episode 2. She goes into the diner and turns on Angelo Badalamenti and just starts dancing, because she does that, and that's a great scene. And she, you're not sure of her motives, and over the course of that first season, what makes her arc so great is that Dale Cooper is the conduit to which she puts this on. But again, she just wants a friend. She wants a sense of belonging. And so she throws herself into Cooper, which means throwing herself into his work and trying to play detective herself, which winds up with her great cliffhanger at the end of the season, which is trapped in the brothel with her dad in the room, which is weird. Right. But like, at a certain point, they abandon that whole thing. And it's like, no, she could still be active and doing stuff. And they kind of just lose what all that is. And, in the oral history, you learn things about like, Sherilyn Fenn had sort of things she wanted the character to be more normal and proactive on the business side of things, and that's where some of those stories came from. But I do think like at a certain point you realize there was some weird chemistry going on where I think no one quite understood on the creative team why Audrey worked, but she worked for a long time until like that lack of understanding kind of collapsed on itself. Yeah,
and it's one of those things where it also feels like her character arc is a victim of solving the Laura Palmer murder, because one of the things I love about her character, and it's something that like thinking about it now and having watched Blue Velvet last night, like she actually has a lot of similarities to Jeffrey from Blue Velvet, of like a lot of that, like of one of like having that like attraction and affection, like crush on an older person of the opposite sex, but then also her weird, like really inappropriate urge to be like really hands-on with solving this mystery.
She's the voyeur. She even looks through the keyhole,
Yeah, and like that side of her that is like, you can kind of partially explain it by her like crush on Dale Cooper and him being a special agent. Like she keeps on saying, oh, I want to like help him. But you really feel like, no, she's like Jeffrey. She can't, like she knows this mystery's happening, because obviously she's also like, she knows her dad is up to something wrong, and like she has this urge to uncover the secrets in the town, and it's like it's something that like I wish that this, because they kind of like float this idea at a couple of points in the series of like her like maybe going and becoming an FBI agent and stuff like that. Like that character arc for her would have made so much more sense and worked so well, because she really does have that just like that weird sort of undescribable urge that like can't be really defined why she has it in some ways of wanting to be involved in the dark, like not involved in the dark underbelly of the town she lives in, but exposing it in different ways. And that's what like makes her very similar to Dale Cooper.
Absolutely. All right, a couple other characters, like quick ones we'd like to talk about. Sheriff Truman, for one, it's an awesome name. Sheriff Harry S. Truman.
That's such a good Lynch kind of touch.
It's great. Michael Ontine is such a great... He's kind of the straight man of the series.
Yeah.
But he's a great character.
Yes.
And I love... One of my favorite dynamics in the whole series is that in most series, the FBI agent would come in and the police would be mad at him and they wouldn't get along. No. The dude's like, yeah, we're a small-town police force. Of course we can't do this on our own. The FBI agent comes in and they become buddies.
Yeah, and their friendship is so much the heart of that whole side of the show.
Yeah.
And yeah, it's
It's great.
Yeah.
Andy and Lucy, I love both of them up to a certain point where the show ruins them.
Well, yeah. In season 2, it's a different thing. But yeah, no, like Andy and Lucy are. Lucy in particular has like some like that performance is so good. She has that. There's a deleted scene in Firewalk with Me where those characters were completely cut out of that movie. Yeah.
And she calls in like Andy and Harry are in like an interrogation room, and she calls in on the intercom, and Harry leaves and comes, and she's just going on and on about something, and he accidentally scares her, and she starts. It's this phenomenal like Three Stooges comedy routine with the three of them.
Where she's like, well, then who am I talking to? And it's like, it's
phenomenal.
Yeah.
No, but like, across the show, Lucy is such a ray of sunshine. And Andy, like, I love Andy is introduced as the guy who cries at crime scenes.
Yeah.
Which is great, because he's this guy who, like, feels deeply, but he's also good at his job. He's not just an idiot. He's simple, but he's like, maybe a character. He's like Andy Griffith or something.
Yeah.
He's a good character. I love Hawk.
Hawk's good.
Native Michael Horst, by the way, the actor who plays him in the oral history, he's my favorite person in that book. He has the greatest things to say. He just has all these phenomenal quotes. In fact, you talk about something while I look for one.
Okay.
I don't know, with the police and that whole side of the show.
Okay, yeah.
There's also like Albert, and you get Gordon Cole in there.
Gordon Cole. I mean, yeah, I do. I love that you have the murder mystery side of the show, and you have like obviously the investigation going on. You have all the cop characters, but again, with like going back to the three pillars of the genres, I love the way that the soap opera side of the show, like, infiltrates it like consumes the police station as much as it does any other side of the show, and that you have the weird like maybe on again off again relationship, who knows, between Lucy and Andy, and how like weirdly undefined it is in season 1, like weird like international pilot movie notwithstanding. You have obviously the whole like secret relationship between Sheriff Truman and Josie, and just I like that the police station side of the show feels like it has its own sort of like ecosystem that it exists in, that like when you can cut away to it, it has its own mood and its own sort of like pacing to the rest of the show that gives you a different mode to sort of engage with.
Yeah, it's its own world.
Yeah.
And it's a great little world.
It's got its own main characters and its own little supporting cast, and it's a lot of fun.
Yeah. So I was mentioning I love Michael Horst, the guy who plays Hawk. 2 quotes from him, because these are just great. This is one he's talking about kind of the magical realism of the show. And he says, I'm the most un-New Age guy in all of freaking Berkeley, but if you grow up in a traditional native community, you know there's spirits wherever you go, and there's always a battle between good and evil. I knew where it was going. Both David and Mark know the psyche of the human spirit. A lot of native ceremonies, we do have characters that are bigger than life, and they are basically showing the community that these things exist, and they are part of the human condition. I just love that quote. I think it's a really good summary of the weird spirituality of Twin Peaks.
Yes.
Like, because Hawk is kind of a small character on the show, but I do love that character's presence, and Michael Horst is a guy who's clearly thought about these things, because he's in most of the episodes, even as a side character. Then there's one where he's talking about Michael Parks, who came in the second season and played Jean Reno, Jacques Renault's brother, who has a French-Canadian accent, even though Jacques Renault did not.
Yeah.
He's great. This is a great quote. Parks is a pretty tough-ass guy, and of course a big icon to me. There's a scene where they got him and he's dead. I forget who was directing, but they said, Hawk, you kind of kick him to see if he's dead. I looked down, and Parks looked up at me and said, kick me and I'll rip your throat out. I said, I'm not kicking Michael Parks. He's dead. Trust me. It's a great anecdote. Anyway.
Yeah.
So yeah, you got all those characters. We already talked about, Ray Wise and Richard Bamer and some of those characters. Yeah. So, I don't know, any other major characters from the show you'd want to talk about right now?
I think we've covered the main bases.
We're talking about Wyndham Earl and no, I'm kidding. We'll get there.
Wyndham Earl.
All right, here's something I want to do. I want to get into like the second season and some of those things, but I also want to walk through. There's an argument I've always made, and I think you agree with me on it, and I want to try to articulate it here.
Okay.
Which is that Twin Peaks has lots of great episodes.
Yes.
It had lots of great directors.
Yes.
But the 6 David Lynch episodes, I would argue, are probably, if you were to rank the episodes of Twin Peaks, are somewhere 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6.
Yes.
Now, why is that? I think there's a lot of ways you can answer that. But one of the things I did when I was preparing for this podcast is I went through and I rewatched all of the David Lynch episodes again. Some of them I didn't watch all the way through because like the season 2 premiere is like 2 hours long, and I kind of watched favorite scenes and stuff. But like I did, kind of try to re-ingratiate myself with a sense of why do I find these episodes so powerful. And there's a lot of ways we can do that. But I want to talk about like the specific episodes.
Right.
So we talked about the pilot.
Yes.
We talked about episode 2. He then came back for the season 2 premiere. And the season 2 premiere has so much I love in it. It also starts some of the dumb stories because season 2, if that was the season where now they had to make 22 episodes. They didn't have the lead time they had on season 1. It's a little sloppier just by virtue of how it was made.
Yeah.
But you still get stuff like the first 10 minutes of season 2 is an excruciatingly long scene where Cooper is bleeding out on the ground, and the room service guy keeps coming in. He brings him his milk, and then he keeps coming in and going out and saying and doing mundane things, including making Cooper on the ground bleeding out sign for the milk. And only after all of that is done do you get the giant who then gives the 3 clues, including the owls are not what they appear. That is one of the funniest scenes in all of Twin Peaks.
Yeah.
And it's
just that thing. It's so... One is so David Lynch, but it's also just so Twin Peaks of you have the ridiculous season 1 finale with this incredible cliffhanger that comes out of nowhere of Dale Cooper getting shot in the doorway to his hotel room, and you have no idea who shot him. And then the whole beginning of season 2 is this incredibly slow scene that's of him, because again, he's having that interaction with the milkman dude who comes, but he's on the ground dying the whole time, but neither of them acknowledge how weird the situation is at all, and that's what I love about it. That's just they just proceed as if it's normal in that kind of magical realism way of is the milkman real? It seems more clear that the giant is some sort of figment of his imagination or some spirit or something. But it's everything about that scene you feel I have no idea if this what form of reality this would ever be taking place.
It's so and when you read about David Lynch, or particularly that oral history has so many great things where he constantly likes to slow things down.
Yeah.
Where and they say this about the guy bringing the milk, and then also in the season 2 finale, the dude at the bank who's getting the keys, that they will always have Lynch will say, all right, amble slowly through the room, and the guy will do it, and you'll have a quote from the director's assistant or something, and they'll say, we all thought he was moving too slowly. Of course we're going to have to speed this up. This is TV. And instead Lynch would say, that was great. Now we're going to do it again, and I want you to do it half as fast.
Yeah.
And that's how he likes it. And he likes it with music. Angelo Badalamenti will always say he always has to slow his music down because Lynch likes it down tempo. And that is, I think it's a key to how Lynch reads cinematic weirdness is time dilation.
Yeah.
And you get that there. I love all of the cliffhanger resolutions, though, in season 2. My other favorite is how Audrey gets out of the situation in the brothel is wearing the mask to fend off her father. That's a scene out of Blue Velvet. That is so Freudian, Lynchian. It's great. I also like the turn Donna makes in that episode where because she gets Laura's sunglasses, she suddenly becomes a smoking femme fatale. Now, that was apparently because Laura Flynn Boyle didn't like the character from season 1 and thought she was too passive, and so everyone else on the show thought that was a weird turn. But I can just see Lynch and Frost going, yeah, we can do that. And that leads, of course, to all the stuff with the Meals on Wheels and all that, which I actually like that whole subplot in season 2. But I actually do think Donna becoming a more proactive character was interesting.
Yeah, and it felt right. It felt like it's part of her character development was her realizing that she is too passive. It's not just the actress seeing that. Yeah. It's natural to the writing of that character that at some point, particularly the more she finds out about Laura, the more she realizes like one, like Laura's really fucked up, but also she admires Laura in so many ways,
Yeah.
and trying to emulate her felt proper.
And so much of season 2, the early going, is about characters having hit these breaking points and changing.
Yeah.
And there's this metamorphosis going on. And so I actually think the abruptness of it is fun.
Yeah.
That she like gets the sunglasses, and that's when she starts doing the smoking femme fatale thing.
Yeah.
Smoking in that she's literally smoking a cigarette. I'm not trying to like objectify her in that way.
Sure, yes.
Yes. But anyway, because there's a lot of smoking on this show.
Yeah.
And I
Well,
hope
it was the 90s.
I hope Showtime let them do it for the new season, because what's a Lynch movie without smoking?
Yeah.
Anyway, Lynch also did episode 9, the second episode of season 2, which has a lot of things you could focus on. It also has one scene in particular, though, that I love and strongly remember, which is where James, Donna, and Maddie are in their house, and out of the blue, never explained, never mentioned again, the three are recording on like an 8-track a love ballad together, where James is doing guitar and singing the vocals, and the other two are doing backup. And I think it's one of the scenes that most strongly demonstrates to me how David Lynch's touch works. Mm-hmm. Because on the page, that's not a scene. There's no reason for it to exist. There's nothing it gives you, really.
Yeah, nothing ever set it up. Like, like, nobody ever says that they're going to make that. You never know beforehand that James can play guitar or sing or anything.
And it never happens again. But, like, as he directs it, where he kind of pushes those actors onto this precipice, you know, even if he doesn't push them over. And then it's all this careful focus on gazes, where I got to see if I can find the quote about this because it's great. But, you know, it's about all these characters looking at each other, and it's strange and hypnotizing, and it's this meditation on the fundamental Twin Peaks theme of duality and merging,
right,
where James is presented with a vision of the woman he loved and a vision of the woman he loves, while Maddie is presented with a vision of a guy who used to love the woman who looks like her, but she's weirdly aware of it, and all the stuff with Donna, too. It's so weird and fascinating to me. And so that's just a scene. I mean, is that also a scene that like, strikes you? Because I don't hear a lot of people talk about it.
Yeah, like, because it's one of, like, those, like, real non sequitur scenes, which is more, like, I feel like a lot of David Lynch's other works have more of the non sequiturs of, like, you know, because obviously this has the non sequiturs of, like, the fucking Red Room, but this is just, like, a normal scene that's just, like, that takes place in normal day life, that is it's never set up, is never really brought up again. It just sort of happens. I think my favorite thing about it, though, is that song then becomes a part of, like, of the soundtrack, of, like, the normal soundtrack of the show. Not that they're, like, those characters are ever really listening to that song. It just pops up every now and then.
It does, because it was an original thing written by, and it actually fooled me the first time I heard it. I thought they just found some song from a 50s song catalog, but Badalamenti wrote it, Lynch wrote the lyrics. It's an original. And it's fascinating. Here's the Lynch quote on this. So, the author sets it up. He says, the entire song is played in real time while the audience waits for something to happen, and nothing does. It's just that song. And Lynch replies, right, but something does happen. It's a cliche scene in a way, but in a million living rooms, people get together and they noodle around and they play something for somebody else, and there's nothing like it. In that scene, there was an undercurrent of one girl looking at another girl, looking at the boy, looking at her. That's a phenomenal description of that scene.
Yeah, because it's also, it's like that scene, I think is like, honestly, that scene might be the reason why that whole love triangle is one of, like, the stronger subplots in season 2.
It is,
like it creates this sense of, like, chemistry and tension between those three characters that feels really natural, and again, like, it's something that, like, you know, if you go to, like, a creative writing class or, like, a script or, like, screenplay writing class, they would tell you to cut that scene out immediately, because it's like, it so defies so much about, like, the conventions of how you set up scenes and pay off scenes. But for whatever reason, it's weird non sequiturness and, like, the naturalness with which it's played, which is like what David Lynch says, like, the scenes you usually don't actually see a lot when you're involving, like, musicians or, like, instruments in film or TV, of, like, because I play guitar, and that's what I do. Like, I don't play in a band. I don't, like, I don't, go around playing for people. I don't play in parties. I don't, like, play on the street to lift, like, a hat to make money. I just kind of play for myself, and then every once in a while, if, like, people are over, sometimes I'll, like, just, like, have the guitar there, and then maybe someone will ask, oh, can you play a song? They're like, okay, I'm going to play a little song, and just kind of mess around on the guitar. And there's something very natural and fluid about that scene that then also, it just, in Twin Peaks, it just sort of almost, like, creates that whole dynamic, because it doesn't really exist before that point in the show, and there's all of a sudden, it's like, okay, yeah, there's a whole love triangle here, and it works.
It works on an emotional and, like, instinctual line, and that's what makes it work. It's not there for a narrative line, and it doesn't need to be.
Yeah.
But I just think that's a scene worth talking about. So then we would jump ahead with Lynch to episode 14. It's a key episode, and now we can talk about, I think, the resolution of the Laura Palmer arc. Because it involves this episode and 2 past it. So everyone always says that, like, all right, season 1's great, and then the first 9 episodes of season 2, because the end of episode 9 is when Leland dies.
Right.
And that's like, they put the nail in that coffin. And then from that point on, the series kind of goes off the rails, and then people like the finale to varying degrees.
Right.
Which Lynch also came back to direct. I have a weird argument on this, and I don't think you and I have ever talked about this specifically, and I want to hear your thoughts on it too, where I think episode 14 is the best episode of season 2. I think it's one of the best episodes of the show, and I think it has maybe the best sustained sequence, definitely in the second season, which is the last half of that episode, and it's where Leland kills Maddie.
Yeah.
It is one of the most shockingly violent things ever aired on TV. Even though it's not graphic, it's just the brutality of it is, and like the way it cuts, in that there's not a lot of cuts in that scene, and just, it's horrifying, and it's intercut with this long sequence at the Roadhouse where all the other characters basically are listening to Julie Cruz sing up on the stage.
Yeah.
Classic David Lynch kind of scene where there's a proscenium and there's a woman singing and there's velvet curtains behind her and everyone is feeling something they can't say. And then as the murder happens, like, everybody just starts breaking down. And actually, you mentioned Bobby earlier. That's my favorite Bobby scene in season 2, where he just starts, he's with, I think, Madge Namek's character, Shelley, and he starts crying and he doesn't know why. But they all have this sense. And then at the end of the scene, once all the violence has happened, the waiter comes up to Kyle MacLachlan, to Dale Cooper, and just says, I'm so sorry. And then he realizes what happens, and it cuts to these final haunting shots of red curtains closing and everything. And that's the end of the episode.
Yeah.
I think Twin Peaks should have ended there. And I think that's a weird opinion, because I know a lot of people love the next 2 episodes. And I don't dislike the next 2 episodes, but I do think they rob something from that moment.
I agree. No, I don't, it's something where it's like there's no perfect spot to end Twin Peaks because they just didn't end it well. So it's like you can, stop watching wherever you want to stop. I mean, I think it's fun to say and do the thing of like, oh, I just watched the first season and then the first 9 episodes of season 2. It's like, just fucking watch all of Twin Peaks. Like, even when it's bad, like, it's interesting. Like, just fucking watch the show, like, or don't watch the show.
But I really felt the first time I watched the show, and then when I did kind of my half rewatch I recently did, when I get to that episode and the credits roll, the show is over. And whatever comes after that is an epilogue, it's a coda, it's an alternate story, it's something else. Once you see Leland did it, and that there is Bob, but it's not made explicit that Bob is a spirit haunting his body or whatever else, the notes are all checked. All that's left to do after that is the legwork of finding him. And at that point, Cooper's going to find him. And the chickens are going to come home to roost. And that's not what that's just narrative checking. That's just the murder mystery. That's not the other 2 pillars, I don't think.
Yeah.
But I think that scene of it happens again, there is no stopping it, and all of that, there is something about it that it's a bleak-ass ending for Twin Peaks, but I think it is so true to what that show is, and ending it on a note as haunting as the one that started it. I don't know. It feels like Lynch directed that as a series finale, even though it in no way was. It was the 7th episode of a 22-episode order, But, like, I just think they went for they batted for they went, I don't know what I'm trying to say. They really went for it. They really went for it.
Don't try to come up with a metaphor.
Because you can't. I'm thinking the scene and I'm disturbed,
Yeah, no, I mean, I basically agree with you because I also, I don't like how they wrap up the Bob stuff.
Well, we can talk about that,
season 2. And because it is something where, I don't necessarily, again, I don't think, that's, this episode is a perfect ending to Twin Peaks or anything like that. But I would kind of agree. It's, the best ending that exists, if you're going to stop somewhere and say, this is what I consider to be, the Twin Peaks canon or whatever, I think that is as good a point as any. But I do think, there's, there was still more to be done with, having Dale more directly confront that side. And, I would have loved to have seen that be done in, the more delicate fashion that it needed to be done, the way that this episode was treated. Because it is, that murder of Maddie is so just unbelievably uncomfortable in the ways of watching a Blue Velvet or something like that, which is having the scenes in a aired TV show, especially in the early 90s, that are as disturbing as a movie like Blue Velvet is insane to think about of like being able to put something like that on TV, but it's absolutely one of the most unsettling.
I don't think there was anything as viscerally disturbing on television between that and the show Hannibal in the 2010s.
Sure.
And it's incredible to me. Like, I mean, just the way it ends with him. I mean, he breaks her head against a painting, and there's that line that I don't know if you're supposed to laugh at it or be horrified by it, but, go back to Missoula or whatever it is.
Right.
And it snaps her into the picture of Missoula, Montana, which, by the way, is David Lynch's hometown. So that's a little weird place to put that Easter egg, David Lynch. But yeah, it is so unflinching. And let's get into the Bob thing.
Okay, yeah.
Because I think what Bob means to you kind of says what kind of Twin Peaks viewer you are. And I don't like where they go with Bob later on.
Yeah.
Of like, he is a literal spirit that literally inhabits people and literally makes them do bad things.
Yeah.
That's boring.
Yes, it's dumb.
It's dumb. It absolves Leland of agency, which I don't like. And it makes it less disturbing. Because if it's just a ghost, whatever.
Yeah.
If it's actually what I read Bob as up to that point is not necessarily real, but this sort of ethereal force that exists in the trees and in the darkness and in the wind and can infest men's heart in a kind of metaphorical, surrealistic sense. And that Bob, Leland has been touched by this because there is darkness within him, not because Leland walked out of a house and went and decided to corrupt Leland Palmer.
Yeah.
And I think, the show in the next 2 episodes really goes heavy on that. I think other writers kind of went heavy on that, and I think fans sometimes go heavy on that. Like, if you read the Wikipedia plot summary of Fire Walk with Me, I disagree with it. Mm-hmm. I literally disagree with the plot summary, and it's weird that you can say that.
Right.
But they have like a whole strong interpretation of like what the ring means, and that's supposed to stop you from getting infected by Bob. And the whole thing was Bob was trying to take over Laura's body and all this stuff. It's like, that's too literal. That's too literal. That's not what's going on. I think it's simple, and I think when Lynch directs, he has a kind of lightness of touch with this, where you can read into Bob whatever you want to read.
Yeah.
And I think it's Tim Hunter who did the episode where Leland dies. Tim Hunter is one of the all-time great American TV directors. I'm not taking anything away from him. But when it's not David Lynch, and when you're framing it in a certain way as, the spirit leaves the body, it becomes less interesting to me. And I think there are some great scenes in those next 2 episodes as they kind of wrap things up. But there's also, to me, like, Leland gets off too easy, frankly, especially if you look at Fire Walk with Me and where they kind of reorient that character. You take away everyone's agency because Bob is a literal thing flying around in the trees.
Yeah, and it's something that, to me, it, like, really, and it's something that especially the episode where Leland dies and, like, they sort of, like, put a cap on that plot, like, really does a huge disservice to something that was that then Fire Walk with Me is like all about. It is so amazing about. That's a small undercurrent about the relationship between Leland and Laura Palmer, and like that whole dynamic is it's an abusive relationship, and like there's a whole part of like the setup of the show and the pilot and like everything you find out about the murder that the show, particularly in season 2, like conveniently forgets about for long stretches, and then kind of like sort of half addresses and then hand waves away also in the last episode with the Laura Palmer investigation by having Bob be so like literally embodied as a supernatural entity is Laura Palmer was raped. Like there's like a whole component of sexual violence to
incest.
That crime.
It's an incest.
Yeah, it's incest, it's abuse, it's rape. Like there's a sexual component to the crime that, and I get that like, it's really heavy material, and I get like, especially for like network television, like not trying to dive into it too deep, but it is something that I feel like when David Lynch was directing some of those episodes, you could deal with that material in a way that you could show on network television, but is still intense and still feels real. And like I said, the way they handle the Bob stuff was totally absolves Leland of any of that relationship and of that like abuse and being culpable in that abuse. And that's so a part of the horror of the show and of the horror of Bob and of the horror of that darkness that Bob represents, or whatever, however you want to read it. I always thought like they have so many great little touches of setting that up. I feel like they fail to execute on, of like Leland telling that story of like him knowing who this like Bob guy is. It's like, oh, when I was a kid living in this place, like on this lake, like he lived over here, and he said like had the match or the light or whatever. It's like, you want to touch the fire boy, or whatever he said. Like all of that. I think that is such a great way of setting up this idea of like well, Leland was probably abused. Like, Leland had was the victim of abuse at some point in his childhood that then put that darkness in him, that he was a victim at some point. And that's how Bob is spread. And that's how, like, we reading the stuff of, like Bob wanting to possess Laura Palmer, which I think is stuff that is sort of discussed at the various points in the series and in Fire Walk with Me, and you can try to read it that way. I feel like the way the show wants you to read it is that it's not a spirit literally trying to possess a person. It's not fucking Casper, you know? It is this darkness, this intense sort of violence and despair that infects people when they are victims of abuse and victims of trauma.
It's a breaking point of humanity.
Yeah.
It's when humanity can't survive and gets subsumed by Bob, whatever that is, whatever that evil is. And I some fans and critics and stuff really love that scene at the end of episode 9 of season 2, so episode 16 or whatever, where Leland is dying on the floor and there's the water coming down and Cooper reads the Book of the Dead and everything. And I see why people love it. It is a well-staged scene. It is powerfully acted by Ray Wise and by Kyle MacLachlan. It is well-directed, all of those things. But I do think it's letting Leland off too easy. I think it's Cooper not being as, frankly, curious about the world as he typically is. And I think it literalizes something that was not literal too much. And so, yeah, I think once Lynch came in and kind of brought them over the hump on that, the next 2 episodes, I think, don't necessarily drop the ball in terms of their bad episodes of television. I just think they put the show in a direction that I really don't like.
Yeah, and it's where I think it starts of where, like, the sort of the genre definitions and the pillars of, like, it starts breaking apart. Is it loses that sense of magical realism of, like, it's not something where I think you're not supposed to interpret Bob entirely as being like a ghost spirit. I also don't think you're supposed to interpret him entirely as being just like this symbolic representation of abuse. I think he's both of those things simultaneously, but him being both of those things kind of means he's neither of those things. And that's where that sort of ethereal quality of a magical realism or a surrealist sort of piece of work exists, is in not being able to totally define it. And it's such a delicate balance. And I think that's one of the areas where, regardless of how talented the other directors and other writers are on Twin Peaks, and they are really talented, at some point, I just don't think it's totally possible for a group of people to be able to create a sustained work that is able to sort of walk that line over a significant period of time, over the course of 30 episodes of television. You need too much authorial control to maintain that precise balance. Mm-hmm. And it's something that it's just where Twin Peaks never should have gone on as long as it did. It just was not built to sustain that. And that's where I don't blame any of the people working on the show for it going off the rails. It's just it was going to go off the rails at some point eventually.
Yeah. So you want to talk about how it went off the rails?
Yes, I hear you have made a top 10 list. I'm very curious.
Yes, I did, Sean, and that was because I was thinking about all the things that kind of went wrong in the second season, in that second half, and I thought, if we want to make fun of them, there's so many things to talk about.
Yeah.
We should probably order it in some way so we can do that.
A long time ago, this podcast in its original format was the monthly 10 podcast, where we made a list of top 10 things every month. Yeah. I feel like it's only appropriate that we go back to that because I feel like our ideas of doing Twin Peaks podcasts are about as old as that format.
Yeah, so this is the top 10 dumb Season 2 storylines, roughly arranged from least dumb to most dumb, and I think I did a good job with this.
Yeah, I'm very excited because I have not seen this list yet.
Okay. Number 10, Ben Horn and the Pine Weasel. Also includes the fashion show for the Pine Weasel. This is, I think, the most innocuous of the 10. It is fun to hear Richard Baymer say Pine Weasel. Yeah. I will give them that. And it does feel like it was a story written because someone heard him say that and was like, let's have him say it many times. But it really goes nowhere, and it does create an opening for the worst parts of the Andy, Lucy, Dick triangle, which we will talk about later.
Yeah.
And also the broadest comedy the show ever did, where the Pine Weasel gets out and all that stuff. It's just, it's not even the worst Ben Horn story in Season 2, but it's not good.
Yeah. I kind of agree with its placing here of, it's really dumb, and it's it in no way fits anything in Twin Peaks, and show should have been cut, but at least it's really inoffensive. Because it's something where I had totally forgotten that existed until you said the word Pine Weasel. It's oh, right, and I watched this show 2 months ago. So it's I'm not really far away from it.
Oh, I had to do a lot of research,
Yeah.
and the next one, number 9, I only remember because there's a scene in the finale which I rewatched about this, and that is number 9, Donna's true parentage, also related to Ben Horn.
Oh,
this is
right.
the long story arc where Donna learns that Dr. Hayward is not actually her father and winds up it being Ben Horn. And here's the thing, there's actually some decent stuff in this whole story in terms of people's acting, but it's really mostly bad soap opera wheel spinning. And I don't think it really rings out real emotional consequences. For instance, like exploring Audrey's feelings on this, that Audrey and Donna would be sisters.
Yeah.
That just all these things, and then it ends in a stupid way where the cliffhanger is that Dr. Hayward gets in a fight with Ben Horn and punches him seemingly to death, and that's where that ends. It's a weird set of scenes. It doesn't really feel like it organically comes from anything in Donna's arc. It's one of the, I mean, they split Donna and James up at this point, and James is off in a completely different show. So they had nothing to do with Donna, so it becomes this, and that's kind of also where they put Audrey in here. It's just a mess.
It's one of those, like, the mini consequences of wrapping up the Laura Palmer mystery is that all of a sudden now Donna has absolutely nothing to do on the show. So they completely manufacture some sort of conflict revolving around her, even though there is nothing ever setting up any idea that she's not related to her family. Like, what the fuck?
Yeah, no, it's a weird scene. It might as well just be a weird fever dream the characters had. And I should say, I don't even have on this list all of Audrey's stuff in the back half of season 2. I think it's mostly innocuous. The Billy Zane stuff is random, but it's not horrible.
And at least you get to see, be like, oh, hey, it's Billy Zane. I haven't seen him in anything for years.
I know. All right, number 8. Now we're getting into the shit.
Okay.
Leo Johnson in a vegetative state being abused by Shelley and Bobby. This is, I think, the best example of a season 2 story that just suffers from wheel spinning, where they put so much time and effort into a story that just goes nowhere. It shines no real light on Shelley or on Bobby. It gives them nothing to do. It makes both characters too central, I think, to a major story, because I think both Shelley and Bobby work much better on the fringes.
Yeah.
And you know, poor Eric DeRay, who played Leo Johnson, not like I think he's like the best actor ever or anything, but he just has to sit there in a vegetative state for half the season, and it just, nothing happens.
Yeah, and it's like the number of times that they try to play the thing of like, is he really, like, is he waking up this time? Like, is he just pretending? Like, they do that like 50 fucking times. It's so, like, sometimes they do it multiple times in a single episode.
Yeah.
It's so excruciatingly slow. Yeah,
it is.
It's bad.
Number 7. Speaking of Leo Johnson becoming Wyndham Earle's play toy.
Yeah.
All
Leo
right.
Johnson is like, they should have just left him dead.
Yeah.
They really should have just killed him.
Yeah, it is, like, Twin Peaks had a weird aversion to letting characters die, and they should have let more characters die.
Yeah, because then later you could have done the thing at, like, if the Twin Peaks had gone on for 5 seasons of having Leo Johnson magically appear in one episode, and that would have been the most soap opera thing of all.
Yeah, but no, I mean, this whole part is where Leo he runs away, and he gets kidnapped by Wyndham Earle, and it brings out the absolute most annoying side of Wyndham Earle and that performance.
Yeah.
And it strands Eric DeRay again in just this unplayably arch part. It's obnoxious, it's not funny, it's not thrilling, it's not scary, it's just meh. And I hate it.
I don't really have much to add.
All right, number 6. Wyndham Earle and everything involving Wyndham Earle. That's what I wrote.
Sure, okay,
And I could have made this number 1. I could have made this number 2. It wound up at number 6 because I do think there are isolated pockets of good stuff in the entire Wyndham Earle story.
Like, I think it could have been done well.
Yes.
Like, I don't think that it was doomed from the beginning. Like, I do kind of like the idea of, you know, Dale Cooper having this, like, cat-mouse game with some, like, a more active sort of antagonist in the show. I think there's stuff that could have been done well with that. Like, although I think it would have needed to be couched still in the Laura Palmer thing. I think there's, like, interesting material that could have been done with those characters, but it is executed so poorly.
You know, and it gives Cooper something to do. Kyle MacLachlan is great in all of this. You know, he doesn't stop being good because the storytelling is bad. You get the fun stuff where they bring Jack Nance in to help play chess. I at least like that side of it because Jack Nance is so fun, but mostly it's dumb. Wyndham Earle is a terrible character. He's terrible. You have a rant on this, right?
I mean, it's basically Sherlock's version of Moriarty 20 years before Sherlock came out. It's like, although at least if you try to put it in a historical perspective, at least like that kind of psychotic villain would have been somewhat fresh at the time, I guess. So it's like I can kind of excuse it on that. But, you know, it's like a really excruciating character that it's, again, it's that thing where if you want to have your like over the top psychotic villain, the number one thing you need to make sure they are is menacing.
Yeah.
And if they are not menacing, they are just really funny, or they're not, or like they come across as if they're trying to be funny but then aren't, which is the worst thing of all.
Yeah, and Wyndham Earle is many things. He's not scary.
No.
Like his first scene is him playing a flute in a cabin. He's just a terrible character. He's not funny. He's not scary. He's not much of anything. He's mostly annoying, and the things he does are outlandish and stupid.
Yeah.
Oh, also his whole master of disguise thing just plays like a really shitty comedy.
Yeah. The one thing I will say I enjoyed about the Wyndham Earle thing is allowing Kyle MacLachlan to say Wyndham Earle all the time,
Yes.
and it's a very cool sounding name that he says very well.
I do think this whole stretch is also where you get David Duchovny as the transgender.
Yeah, the DA agent.
Which is a weirdly like progressive thing the show did then, because they never comment on it. Cooper is totally accepting of it, and it's a little weird that kind of. I don't think they get the details of that kind of thing exactly right.
Yeah, it feels a bit dated, but it definitely feels like its heart was in the right place. Which is like for something from 91, it's really fascinating that they did that.
Yeah. Oh, do you want a good quote about David Duchovny on the show?
Sure.
All right, here's Kimmy Robertson, who played Lucy. I would run into actors who were desperate to be on the show, one of them being David Duchovny, who went so far as to ask me out and date me, basically. All the time we were dating and talking on the phone, I thought it was because he liked me, and it wasn't until this year, 2013, that I realized he was just doing that to get on the show. I didn't know anyone had that amount of fortitude to put up with me for that long. How smart was he? It's amazing.
That sounds like the most fucking David Duchovny thing David Duchovny has ever done.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yep.
I totally believe that.
Even before he was famous, he was David Duchovnying it up. All right, number 5.
All right.
Ben Horne's Civil War insanity.
I almost would want to put this one lower just because like it's so just like so overly indulgently bad. Like they spend so much time on it. It's so dumb. But like I also legitimately found it completely hilarious.
Some of it's really funny, yeah.
It's so fun. Like, although most of the time it feels like it's not really trying to be funny is when it is at its funniest.
Yes.
But like it is, they do go back to it so long. It takes up such a significant chunk of the back half of season 2.
I'll say this for it. I think if this was a one episode thing and David Lynch directed that one episode, I think it could have worked.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah.
If maybe even 2. It's like 6. It doesn't work. It's too long. It has no thematic or aesthetic reason for existence. I think Richard Beymer tries, and he is frequently very funny.
Yeah.
But yeah, I also think by the end, no one knew what they were trying to say with it. And, the Civil War is a slightly delicate topic.
Yeah.
So, yeah, it's weird.
Yeah, because it is like that subplot just feels like it sort of stops. They just come up with an excuse to stop doing it. And it's like, thank God they did, but...
Yeah. All right, number 4. This is the Lucy, Andy, and Dick show. Now,
this is only number 4.
Yeah, so here's the thing. Kimmy Robertson again.
Yeah.
When I was on Late Night with David Letterman, he asked me something about the show, and I said, I had no idea because I'm not on Twin Peaks anymore. I'm on the Lucy, Andy, and Dick show. We had nothing to do with anything. We had wine tastings, the fashion show, Lucy got pregnant, who's the father? I don't know. It just felt isolated, and I had no idea what was going on with anyone else. We didn't get full scripts. David was gone, and Mark was gone, and people who weren't on the wavelength were running the show. My frustrations took over, and I said that on national television. It's out there on YouTube.
Remember the whole part of Twin Peaks Season 2 where Andy and Dick break into an adoption agency to steal the adoption papers of a kid that I guess they're thinking of adopting or something that they think murdered his foster parents. Like, what the fuck was that subplot? It was just... It's one of the most insane subplots I've ever seen. It's up there in, like... of Jack Bauer's wife having amnesia in like season 1 of 24 of just like, who the fuck ever thought this was going to be a thing? But at least the 24 example, that's like one episode. This is like...
It's half the season.
It's half the season. It goes on forever.
And, it spins out of good intentions, I think, where they're trying to do a love thing with Lucy and Andy. And at first it's innocuous and it's fine. And then she gets pregnant. And you're like, all right, well, we'll see where this goes. And then Dick Tremaine comes into the scene.
In a way that, like... I legitimately, when I was watching the show and he popped up, I was like, did I Did I skip an episode? It's something that
does feel that way.
Like, I watch a lot of anime, and one thing that anime does that like sometimes really annoys me is they will sometimes put scenes at the end of credits, and like sometimes that's fine and like whatever because I tend to just skip through credits if I'm watching like 4 episodes in a row. But sometimes they do a thing in anime where at the end of an episode after the credits they put something that's like this huge incredible plot twist. There's one show where literally I think is when I was watching the what the fuck is it? I can't remember the name of the show, but it's the one show where literally after the credits of one episode, the fucking Earth gets destroyed. And it's like episode 4 or something, because I think it's like a 6-episode OVA series. Tenchi Muyo, that's what it is. It was a show that used to air on Toonami, and I watched it like a couple of years ago because I remembered seeing some of it on Toonami. And so Earth gets destroyed, and then so I skipped that part because I just went to the next episode. And the next episode opens up with the main character floating in space, and Earth has been completely fucking, like half of Earth has been obliterated. It's like, what the fuck? And I watched like the first 5 minutes waiting for it to flash back to when Earth blew up, not realizing I had totally missed the part because I skipped through the credits of where Earth blew up. And that's what this felt like in Twin Peaks of like, did I just miss the whole, did they put a fucking scene at the end of the credits where Dick got introduced, where Lucy went on a date and fucked Dick? What the fuck is this part of the show?
That is the most anime thing I've ever heard.
Yeah, it was pretty amazing.
Full Metal Alchemist Brotherhood does that in every episode.
Yeah.
At least it's consistent.
But yeah, that's the thing. It's like, if it does it every single time, I know to do it. What pisses me off is when, like, 9 out of 10 episodes, it doesn't do it. But, like, on episode 7, it just isn't. Like, fuck off and be consistent about it.
The worst thing about the Lucy Andy Dick thing is it takes 2 characters I loved so much and makes them god-awfully annoying. And I think Dick, I'm not trying to throw shade on the actor, but I just thought that character was way too broad for Twin Peaks. Like, Twin Peaks doesn't really have comedy characters. It has characters who are funny. Dick is a comedy character. It just, the whole thing doesn't work.
Yeah.
Number 3.
Okay.
James and the horrible film noir pastiche.
Yeah, okay.
Here's the thing. This one I think is extra bad because it is so completely separate from everything else. He is off on his own show. He never again interacts with any main character from Twin Peaks. I think he has one phone call with Donna.
Yeah.
But that's not even, they're on the same screen. He just leaves. They never see each other again. No connection to the rest of the story. It's many episodes long. When it's done, you never see James Marshall again. He's just gone. It is like the worst remake of The Postman Always Rings Twice ever made. It's another thing I will say I think David Lynch could have done because he's so good at that pastiche kind of thing.
Right.
He's like Quentin Tarantino without the self-awareness.
Yeah.
In some ways. But, like, this was not good.
No. Because again, like, and it's like the number one thing for a lot of these subplots is, like, they went on for, like, 4, 5, 6 episodes, sometimes, like, 7 or 8 episodes long. It's like... It's like the worst excesses of serialized storytelling and like B character subplots just writ large for most of the back half of season 2 of Twin Peaks, and that one in particular, it is. I think that it's especially bad because none of it even happens in Twin Peaks quite literally. Like you're fully justified in saying it happens in a different show because the statement "it doesn't happen in Twin Peaks" is literally true.
Yes. Or not. It's not even in a Twin Peaks adjacent location like north of the border.
Right.
Yeah. It's just he leaves and he fucks a widow and it's weird. Yeah.
Yeah.
All right. Number 2 was originally like 7 different items, and I realized I couldn't let it be 7/10 of the list.
Okay.
So number 2 is the Sawmill soap opera. This is an umbrella which includes the following: Catherine Martell becoming Mr. Tojimura, Andrew Packard returning from the dead, the revolution that Josie shot Cooper in the season 1 finale. You forgot about that.
Yes, yeah, yep.
The reveal of Josie's criminal history in which she killed Andrew or seemed to. The Thomas Eckhart character, Josie's criminal boss, and all the dumb shit he does. Josie,
and with like the addendum to that, the complete wasting of David Warner who plays that character.
Yeah. Josie killing Thomas Eckhart and turning into a doorknob, literally. Andrew and Pete teaming up even though they hate each other to solve riddles and then find a bomb in a bank vault. And more dumb shit I've probably repressed and cannot remember.
I will say, I love that the fucking bank exploded in the finale. That is the one part of that subplot of, like, maybe you were right. Like, maybe the most spinning wheels-iest of all the subplots of Twin Peaks. but it culminated in the fucking bank exploding out of nowhere.
Oh, the bank scene in the finale is phenomenal.
Yeah, and just like they just open up that vault. It's like you've literally spent like 10 episodes developing this subplot where they have the fucking puzzle box, the like ancient Chinese puzzle box or whatever bullshit, and they finally open it up, and it's like a key to a safe box, and then they go and open it, and it's, you know, David Warner was one step ahead of them the whole time or something, and like actually set up a bomb in there and it blows up. It's like the most like wet fart of any of the subplots, and it's because it like literally was just leading to nothing. It just literally was this like totally like circular, self-contained, insane subplot that culminated in absolutely nothing happening.
Oh, and that scene in the bank is Lynch having so much fun with a bad script.
Yeah,
because it's the long scene where the guy is going back and forth to get the keys, and Audrey has tied herself to the bank vault. It's so funny. Yeah, but that whole subplot. I mean, the Mr. Tojimura stuff is an interesting idea that was really bad.
Offensive,
yeah. That
like
too.
It's like you know, I can accept the like kind of the weird dated stuff with the transgender representation, but they should have known better with the Tojimura stuff.
Yeah.
It was really bad.
Although one of the great stories in the oral history is that they did this. Really, this was just performance art on Piper Laurie and David Lynch's. Like that was all David Lynch. Just we do not absolve David Lynch of dumb ideas in the show, even though sometimes he wasn't responsible for their execution. But no, like Piper Laurie they said she left the show. She's credited in those episodes as some fake Japanese name, and she would be on set like doing it like Sacha Baron Cohen, just not telling anyone she was Piper Laurie. And most everyone saw through it pretty fast, except Jack Nance, who like episodes into it went up to David Lynch and said, "This guy is pretty weird, isn't he, David?" or something like that. And like he didn't figure it out, and I love that. That's so like Pete Martell.
Yeah,
he was just Pete Martell. It's great.
That's really good.
No, but yeah,
I mean, it's like they just shouldn't have like tried to make it a stereotypical Asian character. Like if it just been a guy, you could have done it totally fine. Because I think like that side of it is kind of impressive, of like the acting side of it and the makeup, like on its own. It's just like making it this really over-the-top stereotypical Asian character
it's bad.
Bad.
It's bad. Josie becoming a doorknob, that is one of the worst things in the show, not because it's weird, but because they really, I think, callously reuse, like, The Man from Another Place and The Black Lodge and all this stuff. It's just for something that feels very...
For a subplot that doesn't ask for any of it. No. Yeah.
And apparently in the oral history, that was David Lynch's idea. And again, I would argue if he went and directed it himself, it might have worked. But
also, like, if he had maybe been more hands-on for the rest of that plot developing up to that point. Like, it's not like it could have never been done well, but it was not done well.
And I'm still saying it's on him for that, because if that's his idea and he didn't communicate it properly, and apparently he did, because I think that's a Leslie Linka Glatter episode, and she said she didn't even know why that scene was there. She was just told from the top she had to do it, never had a conversation with David, and that's completely his fault for not communicating that, because I think other people could do it, but it just didn't work.
Yeah.
All right, number one.
Okay,
what could be worse than all this?
Like, so many of the subplots are so forgettable, I actually don't know what it is.
You're going to agree with me.
Okay.
Nadine goes back to school and becomes superpowered. And here's why it's the worst.
Yeah, okay.
It lasts from episode 1 of season 2.
Yes, it does.
And it ends in episode 22 of season 2.
It is the entirety of season 2.
It is 22 episodes. Every goddamn episode of season 2. The good, the bad, the mediocre. Ugly. Every one of them, Nadine believes she is in middle school, and poor Wendy Roby is stranded in the worst thing Twin Peaks ever did.
Yeah.
It is awful. It is annoying. It interrupts good episodes and bad ones, and it lasts for 22 episodes. I don't think you can say Twin Peaks ever did anything worse than this.
Yeah, because it's also like, her and Ed, I really like those characters a lot in season 1. In particular, like, I think she, in season 1, Nadine, has this, like, really good balance of, like, because like when you first see her and are kind of introduced to her, you don't know that she's Big Ed's wife yet, and there's like you just think she's like one of the crazy extras in a David Lynch thing, because every David Lynch thing has like a dozen crazy extras that are just like on the street or something. Because I think the first time you see her is her like opening and closing the blinds in her house over and over again, and that whole subplot of her and like trying to make the perfect silent curtain runners. That's fucking brilliant. It's so good. It's so much fun. I love her side of that story and her weird relationship with Big Ed. And then, then she like tries to commit suicide, right? She takes a bunch of pills.
Yeah.
And then she wakes up in the hospital with superpowers, and they just
22 episodes!
Yeah, with superpowers and mentally reverting back to being a teenager, and that is her character for the entirety of season 2, and it's bad 100% of the time. Other than the one thing I kind of like about it is her getting in a relationship with Mike, and at first Mike being like kind of trepidatious about it. The thing I like about it is that eventually Mike totally is into it, and I kind of think that's hilarious.
It is, but that's a bad story.
It's a really bad story. Yeah, you're not wrong to put that at number 1, because it is. It's just something where, like, if you could have a version of Twin Peaks where that was entirely cut out, it would make season 2 much easier to suffer through in its darkest areas.
Yeah. So my conclusion from all of this, look, some people like to do, like, postmodern analysis of season 2 and be like, no, it's secretly brilliant because of blah, blah, blah.
No.
Season 2 is often really, really bad. And
Yeah.
I think it is interestingly bad. I think it's interesting to study how it got there because it was an example of a show. It's like an animal outside of its natural habitat. Twin Peaks never belonged on ABC. And that it lived as long as it did, as healthily as it did, is amazing. But of course, it died a long, painful death in what happened, because I don't know what other universe it would, do really well in that space.
Right.
So, yeah, if you really love all that stuff, more power to you, I guess, but I don't.
Like, I can see, like, because some of it does get very funny in places,
Yes.
like, intentionally or otherwise, but it can get so excruciating. Like,
Yeah.
it's one of those things where, like, you just wish that season 2 was, like, half as long as it was.
Yeah.
And, like, if all of those bad B subplots were contained in, like, 6 episodes instead of 20 episodes, it would be pretty bearable and easier to, like, make Twin Peaks a, like, full-on complete recommendation for, like, anybody you meet. Whereas I feel like, as Twin Peaks is as a TV show, you kind of need to know the person before you're recommending it to them, of like whether or not they should watch the show, you know?
One other thing, it's not on my list, because it's not the worst thing.
Right.
And this one is weird because some people genuinely love this episode. I really dislike the penultimate episode with the beauty show and everything.
Oh, yeah.
That's
No,
dumb. Here's Sherilyn Fenn on that scene. This is
Okay.
a great quote. The pinnacle of frustration for me was when they had a beauty show or something and all the girls were dressed up. The whole show was starting to feel like it had lost its way. It wasn't character motivated. It was, sarcastically, let's get the girls in a fashion show. I just remember reading it and going, no. It was the only time I ever went to David and Mark and said, there's no way. They said, but we have to have you there. Can you make an announcement for your dad's business instead? And I said, fine. That's why I wasn't up there. It was dumb. I hated the whole second season. I love how far she goes with it.
That's really, because it is, because that reminds me of, like, another whole and really bizarre subplot that's very easy to forget about, which is the mayor and his brother that runs, like, the newspaper in Twin Peaks, and the weird Southern Belle lady that, like, they both are in love with, and they're like 2 80-year-old dudes, and then I think it's the newspaper dude dies and the mayor lives, I want to say it is, and then marries the woman that's like, and then she's just like this, like, incredible, like, sex magnet that every dude in the show is just like wants to fuck, and it's so bizarre.
It's not top 10 bad, but it is weird.
It's really bizarre, and it's like especially weird because that's like one of the only big, like, character subplot stuff in season 2 that is built out of characters that weren't in season 1.
Yeah.
But there's a lot of, like, a top 10 list is not enough to contain all the bizarre shit in season 2.
And I think both of us, we don't love the Heather Graham, Annie Blackburn stuff, but it's not the worst.
No.
And
it's kind of fun to see Heather Graham and go like, holy shit, Heather Graham looked really young in Twin Peaks.
And she still looks really young, and she's like 46.
Yeah, but like, you look at her, it's like, that is one baby-faced Heather Graham. Oh my god.
Yes, she's not technically that much younger than Kyle MacLachlan, who was only 30, but she looks a lot younger.
Yeah. She looks like she's, like, somehow 8 years old in Twin Peaks. I don't know.
Yeah, I like the attempt, I think, to maybe do something romantically with Dale Cooper. I like that they put some effort into it, but I don't think it ultimately worked.
Yeah, and I think, like, in a better season, with, like, better stuff around it, I think the Annie character could have worked and been interesting.
Because Heather Graham's pretty good in that role, I think, actually. But, yeah, anyway, let's talk about the series finale.
Okay, yes.
Quick. So that's the last one Lynch directed, the last one of the whole show. This episode does include resolutions to some truly horrible season 2 stuff, and so I don't think it's a perfect episode or anything.
No.
You know, it's got Donna's parentage, it's got Nadine. I do think it is an example of how Lynch's direction does have a way to kind of lend a weird gravitas to anything he wants to. So they're not the worst versions of any of those scenes. And of course, the back half of that episode is famously bizarre and wonderful in a lot of ways. Also has one of my favorite line readings. I don't even remember the context of this, but Jack Nance says the line, "King Arthur was buried in England, last I heard." That's a fantastic.
Yeah.
It's just fantastic. But yeah, so there's some bad things, but, the second half, when you have, Cooper going, "Ooh, sycamore trees," and them disappearing behind the red curtains and all of that, there's some haunting, gorgeous stuff there. I think that the big closing scene in the Red Room is just... It's 20 minutes of David Lynch pissing all over ABC standards and practices, and I love that. And there's that one moment where Cheryl Lee, Laura Palmer, says in the Red Room, "I'll see you again in 25 years." And that is so eerie because this new show is coming 25 years after Fire Walk with Me.
Yeah.
So there's a literal 25-year gap. I don't know how they planned that. But, there's just things like that. So there's some really good stuff in there. A lot of people... I don't think that we like this episode as much as everyone else does, though.
No, because there's nothing the episode could have done to be like this incredible episode of television. Because it's like, again, some of those subplots that have been running for over 10 episodes.
Yeah.
One of them had been running for 22 episodes and had been bad basically the whole time. There's no way to make an episode that's resolving all those subplots and have it be good because all of the setup is bad. It doesn't matter who you get. It doesn't matter how talented the people are. It was too far gone at that point. All the Wyndham Earl stuff is bad. And I also think, the show had already really destroyed so much of the balance of the magical realism stuff at that point that even though I really love on the sort of the craft level and just the weird experience of it, the ending of the season finale and all the Red Room stuff, at the same time, I think it's on the back of so much bad, blatant bullshit of the Black Lodge and the White Lodge, and I still don't like the decision to have a physical spot in the world where the Red Room opens and closes, where the curtains are. Even though I think it's a cool image and I think it's executed well, the idea to me of having this clear area where Bob appears from is bad. It is I wish that they had never done it.
Yeah, they over-literalize so much of that even when you have, straight from the tap Lynch weirdness at the end of the episode, it's not enough to kind of overcome some of those. Honestly, the episode might have worked better for me this time when I watched it completely out of context.
Right.
Because you can just focus on the Lynchian of it all.
Yeah.
But yeah.
And I feel just some of that stuff in the way that it's overly literalized really invites that kind of very literal interpretation of trying to be who is the man from another place really? What is all that stuff? And that's leaning too hard into that is the exact opposite of what Twin Peaks is and needs to do.
Yeah, exactly. So still, it's an interesting finale. Clearly they had an idea in place of what they were going to do where it ends with Cooper coming out of the Black Lodge and being possessed by Bob. I'm really curious if the new show wants to do anything with that.
Yeah, I don't know what is to be done with that.
I'll be honest, I kind of hope not.
Yeah, me too.
They did in the oral history they talk about, that was a plan. They didn't do that just to fuck with ABC. They wanted that to be a story. They had an idea for it. They wanted to try to restore some of the horror around Bob and all this stuff. But, I don't know if I even really see what thematic value that story adds, I guess.
Yeah.
Especially because it still comes from, I think, the literalizing of Bob. And Cooper hasn't done anything thematically to earn Bob,
Yeah.
So that's not interesting. If Bobby got possessed by Bob at the end, that'd be interesting because he's a guy who's been through shit.
Yeah.
Or Shelley, frankly, would actually be a really interesting one. I don't know. But just because Cooper is your main character, you do that. And I love the last scene is sufficiently creepy with Cooper breaking his head against the glass, which was also improvised by Lynch. That is not in the script for that episode. All he did was squeeze the toothpaste out in the script. And in the episode, of course, Lynch has him crack his head against the glass, which is fascinating.
Yeah.
But yeah, it's I don't know. It's not an ending, obviously, and you can't judge it that way. They got canceled, but it's an interesting note.
Yeah, it's a weird. It's just something where, again, there's nothing to be done to rehabilitate Twin Peaks at that point, going forward in that model. It just couldn't. I don't think there was any way to recover it. It's something that now we have the distance from it, and we have this very different sort of TV model that David Lynch can now be a part of. I think Twin Peaks can go forward in a TV show form now.
Yeah.
But yeah, at the time, I think it's good that it ended when it did there.
Yeah. All right, one last thing to talk about.
Yes.
And that is the movie, Fire Walk with Me. So the show finished, it was canceled. There was a letter writing campaign and all this stuff. It actually aired very infrequently in its final episodes. The final 2 didn't air until they did it in a 2-hour block in mid-June on a Saturday or something. So it barely got all the episodes aired, and then it was done. And David Lynch kind of jumped immediately into production on the film Fire Walk with Me. It was intended to bring back most of the main characters, and in scenes that were shot, almost everyone from the main cast is in it.
Yeah.
Some people refused to be in it. Sherilyn Fenn was fed up with it. Laura Flynn Boyle refused, and her role was too important, so that was recast. And then Kyle MacLachlan was intended to be kind of the main character of the first section of the film, but he did not want to be that heavily involved with it. He's given multiple reasons over the years. I think part of it is just probably there was a lot of fatigue after the show ended.
Yeah.
And so he has a smaller role in the film. The film has an infamous reputation when it debuted. It debuted at Cannes Film Festival 1992. It was booed, it was jeered, and there was a famously contentious press conference after the film's debut in which critics were just trying to rip the movie to shreds. At the time, fans and critics really hated it. It had a negative reputation for many years. I think it is enjoying a critical reevaluation, although I still see people, even people discovering it now, who viciously don't like that movie.
Yeah.
And I can understand why.
Me too.
You and I both think it's a masterpiece.
Absolutely. Like, it's something that, like, I think I can understand some of, like, if you're a huge fan of Twin Peaks, I think there's a chance that you will not like Fire Walk with Me, because there's a lot of stuff that Twin Peaks is that Fire Walk with Me is not, and, like, is not interested in providing. There was some form of that, hypothetical form of that movie that had more of that stuff, because they shot all the more sort of soap opera-y comedy elements with the other cast members. But then the movie as it exists has all that stuff cut out. It's a very focused movie. It's a very dark movie. It is, like, I think we've talked about this, like, probably the most explicitly horror movie that David Lynch has made, which is a guy who's, like, basically everything he makes has horror elements, at least as, like, a really core part of it. But this is, like, it is a horror movie. It is a horrifying movie. It is a, like, intensely dark movie. It's a hard movie to watch in places because of how sort of emotionally intense and draining it is. But, like, it is such a masterpiece. It has such a incredible vision on how to explore topics like abuse, like sexual abuse and incestual abuse, and how to explore those very Lynchian themes of having this, you know, the idealistic 1950s, like, veneer of America, and this, like, really dark underbelly and of abuse and of, like, drugs and all the sort of weird, like, murder and everything that happens here, and exploring those two spaces and having Laura Palmer be this sort of conduit between those two worlds, and then ultimately obviously dying in the end, because the story of Fire Walk with Me is the story of, basically, mostly it's the story of Laura Palmer's sort of, like, last week or so, and, like, you see all the events that are hinted at in the events of the TV show of Twin Peaks, and actually get to see it in real time from the perspective of Laura Palmer, with some, like, weird FBI stuff at the beginning and kind of around the edges.
Well, let's talk about that, because Fire Walk with Me, I think I agree with everything you're saying. I also, acknowledge structurally it is a bizarre movie.
Oh, yeah.
Because it's kind of two movies. It opens with about a 30-minute long series of sequences where Agent Chester Desmond and Agent Kiefer Sutherland, babyface Kiefer Sutherland,
with a nice bow tie.
With a nice bow tie. He is so great in this movie. He is so funny. They are investigating the murder of Teresa Banks, which is also talked about on the show as a previous case the FBI handled by who Cooper believes was the same serial killer.
Yeah, who had the letter under her fingernail. That sort of sets up the serial case.
Yes, and ultimately the Teresa Banks thing it's like a 30-minute prologue. It is not explicitly connected to the rest of the movie. And it even has some of the weirdest stuff, like the scene with David Bowie, which just goes... It's one of the most wild sequences Lynch has ever put together. And it's great if you look at the deleted scenes. It could have been much more conventional with everything they shot, but it's not.
And even then, at its most conventional, it still would have been really weird. But it would have been a more normal level of weird for David Lynch. As it exists, it's one of the most, like, inexplicable scenes I think I've seen in a movie.
Yeah. So you have this whole scene... And the FBI stuff, I would argue, is primarily comedic. It's where you get the lightest touch of the movie, and then it kind of transitions where Desmond disappears and Cooper starts looking for him, and everything just kind of becomes weird and goes to hell, and then you transition and see Laura Palmer, and the rest of the movie is pretty narrow focused on Laura for the rest of the film. I would argue that structure works. And it actually took me a couple viewings to figure out how exactly I felt about it, because I think the first time you see it and are confronted with that almost 30 minutes of non sequitur at the beginning, or what can feel like non sequitur, it's hard to really know how to feel, because the action of the film proper doesn't start for half an hour, and that's weird. But I think it is important to have there, not just as like extra info from the TV series, but it's almost like this. It's like the ginger you eat before you eat sushi. It's like it's a palate cleanser getting you into the world of Twin Peaks and into this weird mystery where you have sort of this typical Lynchian weirdness and humor up top, and you have kind of the FBI investigation, and then it all goes away and it disappears and it becomes very non-conventional. And it's like, oh, this is the world we're entering into, actually. And then we transition into Laura Palmer, who is this girl who kind of exists in this world without knowing it. In a weird way, even though she's actually has a lot of active agency in this film, which is interesting. But I think the structure is valuable for a couple of reasons. One, I just actually think it's important to have some humor, at least up top in this film, because it is such a hard movie to watch. But yeah, I actually find that first half hour valuable and interesting. And, you know, there's also something to be said. This movie cannot stand on its own outside of the TV show. It is in conversation with the show. If you don't know the show, you wouldn't be able to watch it. But I don't think I see that as a feature, not a bug. I think it is in conversation with the show, and the conversation it is having is, this was a show about a murdered girl, and it would be, frankly, amoral not to never let this girl have lived. Yeah. And that's the story they tell, and I think Fire Walk with Me, to me, is the skeleton key that unlocks all of Twin Peaks. Because if you don't have it, then there's a hole at the heart of Twin Peaks. And that is this character who everyone is talking around, but not really talking about. Yeah. And I think you get to have that character here, and I think it is, it adds so much to the show.
Yeah, I agree. And for me, like, the structural stuff, I really love the way the movie is structured. And it, like, honestly, the movie it reminds me the most of is Full Metal Jacket, in terms of how that, like, 'cause Full Metal Jacket has, if you haven't seen the movie, probably the only part of Full Metal Jacket you know is like the first 30 minutes of that movie, which is all the soldiers at the boot camp, and that's like the most famous, recognizable section of the movie. But then after that, like, most of the movie is like most of those characters, or some of the characters from the boot camp, now actually in Vietnam, in the war, but like, I just know some people that like feel like, oh, like the movie, like if it is just the boot camp stuff, like that's all they like. But to me, like,
you have to have both.
You have to have both. Like, it's nowhere near a complete movie with one or the other. And to me, while there's not the, like, direct character connection, because obviously Joker, who's the protagonist of the sort of 1 hour, like the second half or whatever, it's not a half, but let's just call it the second half of Full Metal Jacket, is introduced in the first half, but he's not the main character of the first half. But there is a more direct connection between the two parts of Full Metal Jacket, whereas in Fire Walk with Me, you know, it is much more a sort of, like, symbolic connection between the two pieces. And some of the stuff I love about the first part of Fire Walk with Me is how it is this, like, dark reflection of Twin Peaks, that, like, it's the same basic sort of story setup, but it's you see how not everywhere in America has, like, the small town sensibilities, like, coating over everything, that the town that they go to in Fire Walk with Me is much darker, because it's much lower class. It's like, compared to Twin Peaks, is like this very nice sort of like middle class kind of suburbia hidden in the mountains. Whereas in the first part of Fire Walk with Me, it's this dark, dirty town. Like, you know, Teresa Banks lived in a trailer park, and like they have to go investigate the trailer park. Their relationship with the police station is really antagonistic, and you know, the police are actively working against the FBI, and you know, they go to, I mean, just everything they kind of encounter has some sort of parallel to the pilot of Twin Peaks, and of like Dale Cooper coming into the town to investigate the murder. But it's just dark and it's uncomfortable. And one of the things that is really important to the beginning section of Fire Walk with Me is it is setting up this slow, dreadful pace of, like, there is humor that lightens it in places, but also that's where you're like getting this sense of nothing really big is happening yet. Like, nothing is jumping out of the screen at you, but it's like this slow sense of like, oh, this is bad. Like, this is, you are like taking a journey into something that is really dark, that is like very introspective in how it is dark, and that you're just getting a lot of slow scenes that are very slowly building up that tension. And of, you know, some of the scenes in the beginning of like it's not the Red Room, but it's in that like dimension or whatever, however you want to interpret it, with the man from another place and Bob and everyone locked into this like dark, fucked up, stingy little room with like a TV that's playing static, and there's a bunch of other figures that we haven't seen from the show, and that's like one of my favorite scenes in Fire Walk with Me is just that, and like every once in a while they'll cut to those kinds of scenes and slowly building up that tension and of like there is something so just unbelievably dark and inhuman lurking under the surface of the texture of that first part. And then once it cuts to the Laura Palmer section, like that section of the movie like gets sprinting almost immediately because it is taking its keys of pacing and tone from that opening section. Because it's like really quickly after you cut to the Laura Palmer stuff, do you get some of the big payoff of Bob and the big scares in sort of the middle part of that movie of Bob in her room and stuff like that. That's really interesting. I think there's something that works about it so well. Of like, you know, another sort of structural comparison is another Kubrick movie is 2001: A Space Odyssey that also has a similar thing of having a lot of different sections that are not literally connected, and they're like setting up ideas and setting up a tone that is then executed in another section of the movie that is not literally directly related in a lot of ways through the plot. There's just a couple of things of like Bob is a connection between the Teresa Banks plot and the Laura Palmer plot, but it's so like sort of tenuous and not the strict connector that you expect in a movie, you know?
Absolutely. I agree with so much of that. And I do think this is very much a film they found in the editing room. Mm-hmm. If you watch the deleted scenes, so this is a really special thing on the Blu-rays. There's about 90 minutes of deleted scenes that they shot but are not in the film. And that's a high shooting ratio for something like this. And it was for years it was tied up in rights issues with the French company that funded the movie that they couldn't put out here in the US, but that Blu-ray set that you can get now has all of those deleted scenes, and I recommend watching them. There's some fantastic stuff in there, and I want to go through some of them later because I have some notes on these. But one thing I noticed is that like most of those scenes are comedic or have comedic elements.
Yeah.
Almost all of them involve, you know, sort of cameos from the show. I counted. There are 13 main cast members from Twin Peaks the show that appear in those deleted scenes that are not in the movie.
Yeah.
They cut 13 main characters from the show. So clearly, if you had like a 4-hour cut of Fire Walk with Me that was like that, or shorter that took out other stuff that was in the actual movie, you could have made a much more conventional, fan-servicey Twin Peaks prequel, right?
Yes.
And that's not what they decided to do. And it does feel to me like a movie that was found in the editing room of like, okay, this is what that opening section is, and this is what the Laura Palmer section is, and this is how they go together. And I would venture a guess that David Lynch was feeling his way through all of that, and that maybe on set they didn't know where all of these things were going to go. But I think it plays really well if you can, I think, let go of your kind of preconceived notions of what a Twin Peaks movie should be.
Yeah.
And also, I mean, the other thing to say about Fire Walk with Me is that Twin Peaks the show, while it has a lot of the Lynchian weirdness and all of that, it also ultimately, in like the non-Lynch episodes, chooses to connect the dots a lot more than I think a typical Lynch production would. And Fire Walk with Me unconnects those dots.
Yeah.
And I think a lot of people dislike it for that. Like, it re-obfuscates the Red Room and the Black Lodge and all that stuff. It re-obfuscates Bob and Leland and all that. And I love it for that.
Me too.
I think that's really important that it brings back kind of the mystery and the surrealist dreamscape. Like, Twin Peaks Fire Walk with Me is much more on the surrealistic side of things than the magical realist side of things, if we go back to your original definition of that. But I think it's important. And I even think there's scenes where Lynch is just directly trolling the TV show. Like, early in the movie, you have that amazingly funny scene where Chester Desmond is brought by Gordon Cole to the airfield, and Gordon Cole says, "She's my sister," and points to this weird woman over there who does all these like baseball hand movements.
Yeah.
And then on like the drive over, Kiefer Sutherland asks Chester like, what was with that woman? That was so weird. And Chester goes through every little symbol and says exactly what it means.
Yeah.
That is a direct shot across the bow at anyone trying to literalize Twin Peaks, including Twin Peaks, which in, I think, the episode where Leland dies, does this horrible scene, I think, where they're like, they take everything from the episode 2 Red Room scene and try to literalize it of like, oh yeah, the dwarf was dancing because Leland danced, and that's why I hate that stuff.
Yeah, me too.
And that's just David Lynch making fun of it, I feel like. I mean, and you know, the opening credits are TV static and then an axe goes through the TV. It's not subtle of what's going on here. But like, I do think all of that is important to note with Fire Walk with Me, in that in some ways it's a purer version of Twin Peaks. It's a different version of Twin Peaks. You can call it what you want. I do think it's true to itself, and I think it works on its own terms.
Me too, and I think like I can understand people being put off by the movie, but I also think like you being put off by the movie is caused in a lot of ways by people closing themselves off from the movie, not wanting to sort of accept the movie for what it is and take the movie for itself on its own level. Because again, like there are like important plot details and things like that from Twin Peaks you need to know to appreciate Fire Walk with Me, but also like there are some stuff from Twin Peaks that you have to forget to really enjoy Fire Walk with Me, or sort of ignore and put to the side because Twin Peaks went off the rails and like it lost a lot of itself into like you. I feel like Fire Walk with Me kind of like rehabilitates Twin Peaks and like refines that balance and goes back to like this sense of, and it not only refines the balance, but like refines the balance in such a cool way because now all the like they have worked through the plot stuff of Twin Peaks. Now they like know for sure, like yes, Leland is the killer, and like Bob is like blah blah blah. Like it's like Red Room, and we've explored the Red Room stuff. They've explored all these spaces already in Twin Peaks, and now they get to go back to it again with like this fresh perspective and say like, okay, now that we know all this stuff, now we can take these bits and we can like really, it's like specifically explore how like what the relationship is with Leland and Laura, that we know that Leland is the killer in a way that like having that, you know, not being revealed yet or something like that, you wouldn't be able to explore that relationship in the same way. You wouldn't be able to explore the incestuous connection there. I think is really important that the first, like, you know, the first season of Twin Peaks, that's not necessarily fully present. Like you can kind of read that into Ray Wise's performance that you know there's some sort of like weird relationship with his daughter that's not just a normal father-daughter relationship, but it feels like they had not fully committed in that or anything like that.
Right. Yeah. I mean that's one thing to say. Fire Walk with Me, whatever your other thoughts on it, it is a magnificently directed movie.
Oh yeah.
Every single scene, and that includes the deleted scenes. If you just want to look at them as like some of those deleted scenes are standalone comedy masterpieces.
Yeah.
There's a scene in the deleted scenes of at the sawmill where a woman comes in and is complaining that her 2x4 isn't 2x4, and Jack Nance has to talk to her. It had no place in the movie.
No, you see, that's not actually 2x4. It's 2x4.125 letters.
Yeah. It had no place in the movie, but I am so glad it exists as like its own little short film because it's masterful. But every scene in the movie, it's so well directed. Like, I mean, and down to just little details. There's the scene where Laura is waiting outside after, so I think she's at the diner, and there's the whole thing where she meets like the boy in the mask and all that, which is one of those weird. That is so Louis Spoonwell. If you haven't watched his films, that is David Lynch owes a lot to Louis Spoonwell. That is one of the most Louis Spoonwell things he has ever done. Is the little boy in the mask, but like all of that, and then she has that painting she gets, and she goes home and she sees Leland. We don't see what she sees, but it's basically Leland coming out of the house, and she's screaming and screaming, and just it's like that. What I was talking about in that scene in the pilot where Leland finds out Laura's dead. Just like the careful precision of composition, because Lynch is not a director who draws attention to himself much. He does not have like signature camera movements or things like that, but he's just got an eye for detail and like just quiet character building that I think is so on display in Fire Walk with Me. And this is a movie that was made kind of on the fly really quickly after the show was made, and it's amazing to me how many scenes are just iconically good. Like I mentioned earlier, the scene in the bar they go to, which is like the dark roadhouse, and everyone's naked, and it's, you know, it's like if Stanley Kubrick took LSD before he did the orgy scene in Eyes Wide Shut, and then put some rock music on, which was actually, that scene, it was completely composed by Lynch, which I learned in one of these books I read. But there's just so many scenes I could point to that I think are just outstandingly directed in this movie.
Yeah, and it's just stuff where it's like, you know, coming at it from, you know, someone who's a big fan of horror film, and specifically like the kind of horror, the sort of psychological horror stuff that this feels like it is playing with. It's like there's this, especially like once you have like set up this like really unsettling tension in the first part of the movie, and then you cut to the Laura Palmer stuff. And again, because you know, the viewer, that Leland is the killer, like you've seen the fucking TV show, you know all that stuff. You already have this like, and you know that Laura Palmer is going to die. Like you know all of that going in. There's this incredible sense of dread and this incredible sense of kind of like claustrophobia to her life, and like how trapped she is in that house, and like with everything, and the fucking painting and what they do with that, of just like putting that painting on the wall, and you don't know what's going to happen with this painting, and like kind of nothing happens, but kind of everything happens. It's that sense of like that painting on the wall is like this portal into some place that you like it's this gateway into something that she should not have up there. Like she's standing on, because it's the painting of an open door, and like that doorway in this dark room. And it's like that threshold, and there's something that's so incredibly ominous about that, and seeing that, and just having that presence in her room at all, like for like that whole section of the movie, and you knowing that like this evil is entering into her life, and like taking that painting off the wall and like slamming it on her desk is not going to stop it.
Yeah, I mean, the fact that we enter in the last 6 days, this is not about Laura Palmer's best stretch of her life.
No.
To say the least. She is broken by years and years of sexual abuse. And I think putting us in the fucking smack dab middle of that is what makes it so horrifying. And that she is still mentally blocking that it is her father. I think she is, and you can read it different ways. I think she's aware, but also not aware. It's one of those dualities Lynch likes to trade in. And, talking about scenes I think are well directed. The scene where the one big rape scene we get, where Bob comes in through the window, and it's where she realizes it's Leland, it's her father. Most of that scene, they have Frank Silva, the actor who played Bob, on her. He comes in through the window. But the thing is, we know it's Leland. We know it's her father. Even if you didn't see the show, at this point it's become clear. And I think that's more disturbing than if it was just Ray Wise the whole time. Mm-hmm. Like, it makes it more disturbing because it's this horrible thing she's undergoing, and we are in her mindset of she has... And this is where Bob is really much more scary to me than just an evil spirit. He is this, like... It's why Frank Silva's presence is so important. And by the way, in the oral history, every single person to a person says Frank Silva is like... Or was, he's dead now, was like the nicest guy alive.
Yeah.
But he just had this look where he kind of looks like your stereotypical, like... white trash villain,
Yeah, like a guy you would not want to run into in a dark alleyway kind of guy.
Yeah, at least the way he plays it. I'm sure if you just met him, you wouldn't think that. But, of course Laura would, if she had to mentally block it out, that's what she sees, because that's the kind of guy who should be doing this to her, not her father. And so when you get that cut to... And it is a very horror movie language they do it with, where Ray Wise, like, his face flashes across, and she realizes what's happened... It hurts so much. Mm-hmm. It hurts so much.
And it's something that Frank Silva's performance. He doesn't have like much of a speaking role anywhere in Twin Peaks, but his physical presence and his physicality, particularly that scene where he comes in through the window, is so horrifying. And like the way because he has this very sort of like animalistic, feral, sort of like stalking. The body language he uses is like a panther or something coming up on its prey, and that like slow walk and like slowly sort of sneaking in through the window. Or like I think like the best thing about Frank Silva is and like the way he looks and like the costume he has and all that stuff, and like he's got this very sort of like dirty, like mangy hair and stuff. That appearance is how sort of directly contrasted it is with the like pleasant suburbia of Twin Peaks, and particularly with where Laura Palmer lives. And that's why like that one like shot in the pilot of him like creeping like behind like the bedposts or whatever like is so distinctive and iconic. And it's like one of those things, if you like look up and read about the making of Twin Peaks and the pilot and stuff, that's how like David Lynch, like Frank Silva was just a dude who was like on the production staff who was like working there, and the David Lynch saw him and was like, okay, we need to use this guy. And there's like footage of him that was like, oh, like he's actually like accidentally like in this reflection in the mirror, and we're just going to use those shots. And he just has this like physical. Presence.
They were doing the setup for the shot, and they said, wait, before you roll, there's someone in the. And Lynch said, no, keep him, and it's great.
And it's just because he doesn't fit in the way that, like, quite literally, like people in production crews, they're not in costume, they haven't gone through makeup, like they're not supposed to exist in those environments, and so he's so out of place. And that's where, like, in Fire Walk With Me, I think, like, for me, like, the most horror scene and, like, kind of like the scariest scene is the scene, like, about halfway through. It's before the rape scene where Laura Palmer comes into the house and she knows there's something here, and she's walking up the stairs, just like the most fucking frightening staircase in movie history, probably, is that staircase in the Laura Palmer house, at the Palmer house, that they used to great effect in Twin Peaks, the TV show. And you've seen so many of these like really ominous shots throughout all of the TV show and like up to this point in the movie of just like that staircase from this low angle looking up, and there's like the balcony up there that like with the banister, and it's just like there's something very intense about that staircase and ominous, and like there's the fan at the top of the staircase that creates the sound for the scene, this like slow droning sound with like this click every once in a while. And she goes up the staircase and goes into her room, and when she goes into her room, she just sees Bob in this quick shot. And it's almost like a jump scare, but the way it's done, it's not like a orchestra string, like a cat jumps out jump scare. It's this very natural. She opens the door and you just see him there, like with her diary basically in the room, and she just screams and runs out.
And I think that's
runs out of the house.
And that's the scene I was talking about, where she goes and hides in the bushes, and then Leland walks
yes,
out.
Exactly.
And that's why it's so scary.
And that's where, like, if you haven't necessarily seen the TV show, you can get the direct connection of Leland is Bob, and that's like that sense of this evil existing in suburbia that's like not supposed to be there. And it feels like one of the sort of influences, I don't know, intentionally or otherwise, that Firewalk with Me pulls from in terms of horror film is Halloween. And Halloween very much is that the monster is whatever's existing in this suburban neighborhood, and the safety that you feel here is a false safety. And like the people in this neighborhood that you think are your neighbors are going to help you, they can't do anything to help you. They can't do anything to stop this evil from encroaching into your life. And that evil just being of the household, in the household, being Bob, being her father, and her having no place to run from it, because it's already like this. The first time you meet Bob in the movie is he's already in her room reading her diary. Like he has completely invaded everything about her life. There's no privacy from him, and her private life is him, and like her public life is like everything that she's hiding that from everyone else. And it's like he is her darkest secret, and so there's no place she can retreat where he can't be.
He's the root of all evil.
Exactly.
Literally. And Leland, for her, is the root of all evil.
Yeah.
Because everything she's doing in her life and all the ways she is broken come from, what horrible things she's enduring at home. I think it's so important to talk about why this all matters, too. It's not just that it's effective horror. It's that it's smart and passionate horror. And that, I remember reading a quote by Cheryl Lee once. I don't have it in front of me because it's not in one of the books I read this week, but I feel like I remember reading this, that she said, she's been contacted by survivors of rape and abuse and incest who have said that Fire Walk with Me was actually very cathartic or powerful to them because of how much it got that experience. And I think it's something Lynch... These are the kind of things he explores, and these are the kind of things he tries to shed light on. I wanted to read a tweet I found the other day. This was retweeted into my timeline, and I just thought it was interesting. This was Justine Smith on Twitter, said, "The power of Lynch's films, as with most great surrealists, is the ability to destabilize reality, comfort, and familiarity. The mysteries of his films are an aside, a demonstration of our failure to face and recognize violence and abuse within the home."
Yeah.
And I think that I couldn't have put that any better. That is so much of his work is, but I think especially Fire Walk with Me in a lot of ways, and that it uses the language of not just surrealism in general, but of Twin Peaks surrealism and magical realism to really show you, the kind of horror they were talking about. And, what it does for me is it allows Twin Peaks as like a franchise to step away from the whole, I think most murder mysteries and crime show procedurals fall into of, rape and murder and all these things are just plot points in a procedural,
They're just it's the thing that happens to the victim.
Yeah. And we never think about it. And Twin Peaks doesn't do that. It made a whole movie about it.
Yeah.
It makes you think about it. And once you've seen it, you can't go back and watch Twin Peaks and forget about it. And I think that's really, really important.
Yeah.
And I do understand why some people don't want to think about that, because Twin Peaks is the damn good coffee and the cherry pie and the fun stuff. But if you can't recognize that it's both of those things, and it has to be both of those things, I think you're missing maybe the larger picture of what Lynch and company were trying to create with this world.
Because it's a thing where, you have to, at some point, like I think as a person, you have to be able to recognize that the damn fine cup of coffee and the girl being raped by her father and eventually murdered by her father have to exist in the same world because they exist in the same world. That's like, we live in this world where you can both have this damn fine cup of coffee and have all these fun friends and goof around, but we also live in a world where that shit happens, where people are murdered, where people are raped, where they're victims of domestic abuse for years and years and years. And it's something that, like, David Lynch, it's so key to so many of his works, is that it moves between those two modes and sort of recognizes that is America. Like, America is both of those things. Every, like, human life is both of those things. You have to be able to reconcile the darkness with the light. And with Fire Walk With Me, it is, like, the most intense, I think, of the movies of his that I've seen, of, like, staring into the darker part of it and like, really sort of saying, this is like a kind of, in some ways, like, as bad as it can get for someone, of just being trapped in a horror movie, trapped in this house where she's a teenager. She has no way to escape this situation. She is both, like, in a physical sense she can't escape the situation, in a psychological sense she can't escape, because the person that is committing the abuse to her is the person that she's supposed to be able to rely on to protect her. And that is something, like, it's a common theme in some ways in horror, but it's also, like, very rarely done with this kind of clarity and this kind of intensity, because it's such an intense subject that you want to shy away from it. It's like, it's something that, like, another parallel or another sort of movie that feels like Fire Walk With Me is sort of influenced by is The Shining, Kubrick's The Shining, and that has very similar themes of, this abusive father figure, but even he, like, that, I feel like, doesn't quite.
And hey, there's a phenomenal comparison, because the Stephen King book The Shining totally absolves the Jack Torrance character.
Yes, yeah.
Because he's just possessed by a spirit, and Stanley Kubrick is so the opposite of that.
Yeah.
In that he says, no, there aren't evil spirits. Jack Torrance is a bad dude.
Yeah.
And I think that's what we get here with Leland. I mean, you can't walk away from this movie and then be like, yeah, Leland was okay, he was just possessed. Yeah. No, he does horrible, horrible things. The actual murder scene is as horrific as anything. It is. Most of it actually happens off screen, the stabbing. Yeah. But boy, is it hard to watch. Everything that happens. And there's all these random symbols and things going on with the ring and the red room and all this stuff that I think actually just adds to kind of the discontent and horror of it in different ways.
To me, some of it, like, it feels like stuff like the ring feels like it's trying to give you, like, set up maybe that there is some sort of hope, but also there isn't. And although the ending of the movie is really fascinating, with the being in the red room and the angel coming down, like the painting she has in her room of, like, the angel and the family and of, like, this idealistic home life that she sort of, like, wishes she has. And then
it's the musical ending where it resolves on a note of emotion and passion, but not narrative reality.
Exactly. That, like, that movie ends and Laura Palmer is dead. Like, whether you want, like, obviously, like, there's a very clear religious reading you can read into, like, the angel coming down and everything, but there's also, just said, there's an emotional connection there that, like, you don't need to sort of, like, take a literal, like, religious sort of reading of it being her ascending to heaven.
Yeah. And, the Leland thing, it's hard to talk about, obviously. Yeah. Ray Wise, he has an interesting quote in the oral history where he said, to him, Leland was 100% innocent. He was a guy possessed. He did not know what he was doing. He was not in control, all these things. And the thing is, I understand completely why Ray Wise would have to think that to play the character.
Right.
I don't know if you can play that character the right way and have all those complexities going on inside your head. If you're living in that character, it can still be true that Leland isn't aware of his actions. Yeah. Because I think that's part of it. Because he is, as we can kind of be hinted at, a victim of a lot of these things probably too, in a weird way. But so I understand why Ray Wise, the actor, has to say that. I think when when the show brought in that too, we're just going to literalize that for the whole story. Yeah, that's when it's problematic. And kudos to Ray Wise that he came back for the movie and played it as dark as he did here, because I know he's voiced this many times. He was always uncomfortable with that. It hurt him to play the character that way because when he started out, no one knew that was where the character was going, and he actually talks about in the book. He had just had a daughter, so it's very hard for him to get that headspace of a guy raping and murdering his daughter and all this stuff. But he's so good in this movie. Yeah. It's an amazing performance.
Yeah, because you get, like, some of his best stuff, I think, is all the stuff where you get like, sort of some of the weirdest structure of the movie. You get in the Laura Palmer section some flashbacks from Leland Palmer's perspective to him murdering Teresa Banks. Yeah. And, like, the whole scenario with that and of he was hiring her or paying her to sleep with him, and when he was like on business trips, and then one time, I think like this is a really key scene is he's one time she says like, oh, I'll bring some friends, and then one of the friends is Laura Palmer, and the other one is the other girl who's attacked and then ultimately survives the murder, and that like there's something about that scene of like that like line being crossed there with like where now Leland like has to recognize like maybe not fully what he has been doing, because it's definitely been implied that he's already been abusing Laura up to that point. I think now it's like that's where you kind of see him for a little bit have to realize, oh, like that, yes, like I have these like sexual urges for her, and like one of the main reasons he was with Teresa was because she looked like Laura Palmer.
Yeah. There's an openness to Firewalk with Me where you can do these readings that are not like what you're saying right there, where it's so character motivated and atmospheric motivated, and not strictly like, what does it mean when the dwarf says, I need all your Garmonbosia, and then pulls the blood off of... And I actually think those scenes are interesting, too, because they're not like late-era Twin Peaks where everything feels so coded. It's a lot looser.
Yeah, it's still like sort of trying to build this tone and to get you in this flow. It just so happens that this time the flow is utterly horrific. It's like you're just like... Those, again, like... Not necessarily the Red Room stuff as much, but the stuff in that like the fucking dank, dirty, disgusting one. Like that's some of like just on like a visceral aesthetic level, it's some of like the more disturbing stuff I've seen in a movie. And like there's the great shot of like the one dude with the mask and takes the mask off and it's a fucking monkey underneath it. It's very good.
Yeah. All right. I want to talk about the missing pieces, the deleted scenes a little bit.
Okay.
So a couple of things. Like I said, a lot of the scenes are really fun to watch. Almost none of them I would put in the movie. There's a couple of key ones I wanted to mention, though. I think the best of the deleted scenes in terms of something that might have been fitting for the film is this long scene where Laura is at Donna's house and her parents are there and they've made the huckleberry muffins, and it's got a great line from Mrs. Hayward where she says, I want you to know that I put 7 whole huckleberries in each muffin, which is just a great line. But it's an interesting one. It's this scene where Laura has this real loving family, and the Haywards are so good to her, and Donna has this... Because Donna, I think, is a very different character in this movie, where she represents kind of this wholesome life that Laura wants, while Donna kind of wants Laura's life, and there's this kind of trade between the two of them. But it's really interesting, and there's this whole sweet exchange they have where, Laura tells... Donna, you're the muffin, and then Donna says, I'm the muffin, and it's just this whole sweet thing that happens between them. And then it's all interrupted, this callback to reality, because Leland calls and wants to talk to his daughter.
Yeah.
And it's a great scene. I think you could argue it would slow down the movie. It might even be too warm for the film.
Yeah.
But it's a great, great scene. The performances are fantastic.
Yeah, I agree. It is one of those where it's like, some of those deleted scenes are so good you kind of almost forget that they aren't in the movie because they are... Yeah. Because it's like I think it was smart for them to cut it out, because I think the way the movie is constructed as is, there's nowhere for it to fit in. Like, it would be something that like you would need that early enough that like you could have that warmth, and then like the downfall of it. But like, there's no spot. Like, I don't think it would have to fit in before the them going to the bar and like that whole like insane drug trip kind of section. But there's nowhere in that space of the movie to have that scene.
Yeah. There's another one where there's kind of an alternate final scene with Bobby in the missing pieces.
Yeah.
Because I think in this movie there is a final scene with Bobby that night, but it's a very different version of it. But the one in the deleted scenes, again, it's very long, where they're in Bobby's basement. The Briggs parents are upstairs, so you see them again. And like they're doing coke together. Well, at first Bobby's trying to tell her he doesn't have any left. She finally coaxes it out of him, and it is an immensely sad scene, and it's the pace of it is very different than anything else in Firewalk with Me, and I think that's why it couldn't be in there.
Yeah.
But I love the scene. I think it might be Dana Ashbrook's best work in the whole series is in this deleted scene.
Yeah.
Because it's this slow, mournful scene of these two people who are so fundamentally bad for each other, but they do have this genuine affection.
Yeah.
Great scene. If you haven't seen that, you should seek it out.
Because also, like I love Bobby's role in Firewalk with Me in general. Mm-hmm. Like because it's another one of like it's a really needed role to show like one of the effects of Leland's abuse on Laura is that she's abusive to Bobby.
Yeah.
And kind of like leeches off of him and uses him to get her drugs, and then you have like that, like again, like just like really brutal section where he shoots the dude for like baking soda, like because he thinks it's a drug deal gone bad. Shoots him, and all they get is baking soda. And Laura is so high, she's just laughing the whole time. It's like one of the it's just like one of the more disturbing scenes I've seen in a movie of just like one character like really feeling the weight and consequence of taking this person's life because he's the one who pulled the trigger, and the other character so out of it, so far down her rabbit hole that she can't even kind of like process what has been happening.
Yeah. So, and that's really the climax with Bobby in the finished film. And I'm sad that last Bobby scene couldn't be in the movie, but it's also like the movie has such a freight train momentum near the end. I don't think you could slow down for it. It's a tough call.
Yeah.
But kudos to them for making the call, I think.
Yeah.
And then the other scene, there's one scene I absolutely would have in the movie, and that's an extended version of an existing scene where there's a scene in the movie, it's near the end, where where Laura is waiting for James. She like walks out, goes down the tree, and then James comes by on his bike and she gets on and goes. And that's in the theatrical cut, that's all there is. In this extended scene, she gets down the tree, and before James gets there, Leland arrives, and he comes in and he senses she's there. It's like the most like Michael Myers-esque scene in the movie, and I actually might have kept it there because it ingests like this huge like dose of tension at this crucial moment and would kind of kick off that last act of the movie. It's not like the movie's missing anything huge without it. It's a really scary scene, and that he gets in just as James arrives, so they barely make it out. And of course, Leland's going to get her anyway. So I might have kept that one. It's you could argue it's a little redundant because there are other similar scenes, but it's a really good scene. And it's very artful that they were able to edit around it because very clearly that's how it was shot.
Yeah.
They didn't shoot alternate versions. So anyway, but the missing pieces are great. Everything else, is often feels like out of a different movie. The most surprising thing to me in the deleted scenes is there's a whole long series of scenes following up directly on the series finale.
Right,
where, Annie comes out of the Black Lodge and goes to the hospital, and they have an extension of the scene where Cooper is in the Great Northern, and he like bashes his head against the window.
Right,
I don't quite know what they were planning to do with all that, but it's interesting to see.
Yeah.
I'll say one thing in the theatrical cut I don't understand why it's there is the scene with Heather Graham as Annie where she shows up to Laura. It's a it feels like it should have been a deleted scene when you see all the other ones, because it really has no place, I don't think, in the finished film.
I think it's the one sort of vestige you can see of like one of the original plans that David Lynch had was to make a series of movies that like to continue Twin Peaks, that this would be the prologue or prequel kind of thing, and then since obviously Twin Peaks was not going to get picked up as a TV show, to expand on and sort of like solve the finale in a sequel movie. And I agree. Like that's like the one thing I would cut. Like there's a couple of, I think some of the Cooper stuff in the movie works for me, and some of it like doesn't entirely. It feels like I totally get. There's some of it is like having to write around like Kyle MacLachlan not wanting to be in the movie too much. I think overall, I really like that he is not like the main character of the first section of the movie. I think that works better. But also, I feel like a part of me almost says that thinks that he should have been cut out of the movie all the way. It's like kind of a tough call because I think some of like that stuff of the David Bowie scene and like Cooper like looking at like the footage and looking at the like all that stuff's all really great, but it also feels like maybe there would have been another way to sort of capture some of that stuff without having Cooper, because I feel like he has too much of a kind of gravity to him from being the main character from the show.
Yeah, you do almost wonder like if Kyle MacLachlan wasn't who he is, David Lynch's friend and the main character of the show, if he also might have wound up on the cutting room floor in a weird way, but that would have been a real dick move, so they didn't do that.
I think it would have been a little bit hard to cut him out entirely, because some of those scenes are pretty important, especially like him following up. Like the stuff I do like is him directly following up the investigation of the other two FBI agents who have
I like that too, yeah. So, all right, that's Twin Peaks. This has been a long one.
Yeah.
What are we hoping for from the show, the 18 new hours?
I'm hoping that whatever they do is something I could never possibly imagine that they were going to do, which is what I'm pretty much expecting it to be.
That's what I'm hoping too. Yeah. I am so intensely curious about this. I'm ready to be really annoyed by the internet snap judgments we're going to get.
Yeah.
Because look, David Lynch movies are pretty frequently not well received out of the gate. Twin Peaks is an exception. Mulholland Drive was an exception. I would not be surprised. I already see a lot of TV critics have their knives out and ready for this thing, and it makes me a little sad. I wish we could all recognize how magical it is that I don't know if Lynch has directed fucking 18 hours of movies. I mean, God, you add up all his movie runtimes, they're barely more than 18 hours. This is, I think, pretty special what we're getting, and I don't think, maybe it'll be awful. I'm not going to go into it judging it on the same grounds I judge other TV shows, because it's not the same thing.
Yeah, I mean, I have a lot of faith that it's going to be good. Like, I would be surprised if it was just bad. Like, it might be like not like amazing. Who knows? But I think no matter what, it's going to be fascinating. I'm so intensely curious about like what they do to follow up
any of the story points.
Any of the story points of the original show. Because also, like, that show was so long ago. Trying to follow up it like really directly with like very explicit connections to like the cliffhanger from season 2. I don't know. That seems like that would be a crazy thing to try to do.
Yeah, I have no idea. I'm looking forward to be surprised. Hey, if this is 18 hours of totally avant-garde David Lynch, I'm all for it. So whatever. Let's watch this damn thing. We will be back next week. I think we're going to push the podcast a couple of days from our normal Monday, specifically so we can talk about the Twin Peaks thing. Yeah. Because we can do that in Doctor Who, but it airs on Sunday nights, which is when we normally record. So, but you got 2 podcasts this week. So you should be good. Make up for that. Finally did our Twin Peaks episode, and we're ready for the return and for more Doctor Who and for whatever else we want to do.
Man, you say that, I don't think we could ever be ready for Twin Peaks again.